Ciao a tutti ragazzi, mi sentite? Spero che vada tutto quanto bene. Tanto vedo che siete già un pochettino qui su, diciamo, la sala d'attesa e state aspettando. Grazie ovviamente a chi già mi sta seguendo e tutto il resto. E allora, sto cercando di collegarmi a quello che comunque sia il nostro, esatto, eccolo qua, il nostro momento di live. Ok, eccolo qui ci dovremmo essere. Il video dovrebbe essere ridotto a breve. Perfetto. Più che altro abbiamo un pochettino di problemi per quanto riguarda l'entrata con la streaming e quant'altro, perché penso ci sia veramente tantissima gente che sta cercando di entrare e di vedere questi interventi. Fondamentalmente, diciamo, rispondo già a chi ovviamente mi domanderà ma quanto salirà Bitcoin o quanto saliranno le altre criptovalute in questo momento? Sappiate che non saliranno le altre cripto in questo momento qua specifico. Questo momento qua, queste conferenze che sono state organizzate sono state fatte proprio per lo specifico caso di, diciamo, dover parlare alle aziende delle possibilità che ci sono dietro la possibilità appunto di poter entrare tramite le criptovalute e in questo caso appunto tramite Bitcoin. Ci saranno diversi interventi che inizieranno appunto adesso alle 18 e poi ci saranno altri interventi che inizieranno invece più avanti, tra cui quello di Elon Musk che dovrebbe essere intorno alle 8. Io oggi riuscirò ad essere disponibile soltanto per un'oretta, mettiamola così, quindi diciamo più o meno verso le 7 e qualcosa, quindi vi lascerò adesso nella chat il link per poter seguire la diretta di Elon alle ore 8 che io ovviamente non riuscirò a trasmettere qui sul canale. Ora ve la giro subito. Ditemi se è troppo forte il volume, se volete abbasso.
Welcome to the Demystifying Bitcoin track. 12 years into its creation, Bitcoin is just beginning to gain institutional acceptance. To continue to encourage adoption, education is extremely important. And while constructive criticism of Bitcoin is healthy, unfortunately, the mainstream media and influential financial research institutions still dismiss Bitcoin based on stale information and flawed analysis. In this track, we revisit some of Bitcoin's most common misperceptions in the hopes of advancing the discussion and understanding of Bitcoin and the important role it will play in society.
Vabbè. Questa è stata una piccola introduzione che hanno fatto a quello che è ovviamente quello che andiamo a vedere adesso nel video. Ovviamente che riguarda Bitcoin e tutto il resto. Fatemi sapere ovviamente sempre se si sente bene, se si sente male, mi raccomando scrivetemelo perché è importante.
Hello, my name is Nick Carter. I'm a general partner at Castle Island Ventures and the co-founder of Coinmetrics. I'm here to talk about Bitcoin's energy dynamics, why it consumes so much energy, and what we can expect from it in the future as the protocol evolves. This is a very contentious topic, and I think when the facts are considered, it's demystified, we can become much more comfortable with its energy usage. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So the first thing, a key premise for this entire discussion is that Bitcoin has a claim on some of the Earth's resources.
Ciao ragazzi, grazie a tutti quanti. Ciao,
neutral monetary network.
Sì, ciao grazie, di Gabriele, grazie. Ciao
in a political sense,
ciao
without
Paola,
regard
grazie.
for who is using the network, and it transacts tens of billions of dollars a day, and stores the wealth of hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars, and it's used by, we don't know exactly, but 50 to 100 million people worldwide, and so it provides a genuine utility to tens of millions of people, and so this is a key premise for understanding and conceptualizing any of the energy dynamics, because you have to acknowledge the validity of this network to reason about the costs. If you reject the utility of this network, then no cost, no energy outlay is going to be worth it. But this is a key premise, and of course, other speakers today will be talking about this far more in depth.
Salvatore, la conferenza è già iniziata, ci sono vari tipi di conferenze, ci saranno ovviamente vari orari, questa è la prima, ci saranno diverse persone che parleranno, ci sarà Ark Invest, Squiz, quindi anche i titolari di Twitter e appunto di Square, e inoltre ci sarà poi alle ore 8, se ti interessa in maniera particolare, alle 20 ci sarà Elon Musk. Ho messo nella chat comunque sia il link diretto alla streaming di Elon Musk.
providing settlement
La conferenza è in realtà in live, probabilmente è leggermente in ritardo con quello che hanno fatto in America, comunque è stata fatta oggi. Elon parla alle ore 20, la conferenza con Elon Musk è alle ore 20.
And so the miners incur this cost to create new blocks for the privilege of adding transactions to blocks, and in exchange for that they get compensated with new units of Bitcoin and fees. And so this energy cost incurred by miners encourages them to behave honestly and to pursue a single linear history of the network, as opposed to branching it into other directions or creating these reorganizations where they change the history of the network. The users of this system, they want to have the assurances that their transactions are going to settle, that they're going to be final, and that nothing's going to be changed after the fact. And so the energy cost that accompanies transactions and that is incurred by the miners, that is what grants users of the system those strong assurances. And of course, as I said, at peak, Bitcoin will process $10 to $20 billion a day in final settlements, and it stores around $600 billion today, although of course that changes on a day-to-day basis. So it's providing a genuine monetary transactional utility.
Allora, non metto in pausa in realtà per poter cercare di spiegare anche un pochettino quello che sta dicendo, perché ho paura che essendo in diretta, se metto pausa poi ci perdiamo un pezzo. Comunque fondamentalmente sta semplicemente spiegando il costo delle transazioni che ci sono ogni giorno per quanto riguarda appunto Bitcoin e il consumo che sta facendo Bitcoin in questo momento.
In 2008 and then created it in 2009, Satoshi had this conundrum: how am I going to actually distribute the units of this commodity to the world at large? Satoshi could have emailed.
La live, guarda, ho lasciato il link direttamente qui nella chat. Ora aspetta che te lo
but that wouldn't have
riallego.
exactly been a fair or credible way to initially distribute these units to the world. And so the method that Satoshi settled on was proof of work, where effectively you have to spend energy and computational resources in order to obtain new units of Bitcoin. And so miners themselves, they're not particularly privileged in terms of their access to the monetary issuance, unlike say the Federal Reserve is privileged in terms of access to new dollars. For them it's costless to create the dollars. Because miners,
ragazzi, qualcuno della chat può riallegare il link per favore?
They have relatively thin margins historically, and so no one is able to extract seniorage, able to extract a significant rent from their position as the monetary issuer. Instead, it's this very much free market process. And so proof of work solves this decentralized initial issuance.
Grazie a te, caro, per l'iscrizione, sei stato molto gentile tu.
That's a really key thing to remember as we consider its sort of energy outlay. So, as I said, Bitcoin's security and reliability derives from proof of
come ho
work.
detto all'inizio, magari per quelli che stanno collegandosi in questo momento, questo tipo di conferenze qua, che ovviamente poi leggeremo tutto quanto quelle sarà la loro schedule sotto, è dovuta e così sarà portata a fare tutta una serie di migliorie per quello che stanno appunto le aziende e di vantaggi che le aziende potrebbero ottenere effettivamente dall'entrare nel mondo delle cripto. Quindi questo tipo di live, questo tipo di conferenze vengono fatte proprio per questo motivo, per far capire alle aziende le potenzialità che ci sono dietro il mondo delle criptovalute, in questa fattispecie dei bitcoin. Ovviamente a causa di questa conferenza, di questa cosa qua, potrebbe salire come potrebbe anche scendere il prezzo. Questo dipenderà tutto quanto dai vari interventi che ci saranno e da cosa aveva detto. Comunque ricordo sempre per chi si collega in questo momento che alle ore 8, quindi alle 20 ore italiane, ci sarà Elon Musk che parla, visto che a tanti interessa Elon, ci sarà alle ore 20.
In progressive Bitcoin blocks gives you a similar kind of assurance. Once a transaction has occurred in the Bitcoin ledger, once sufficient blocks have been mined, that transaction is assumed to be final. And so in the case of the clay tablets, it's the sun's energy, which is providing you that kind of finality and calcifying the ledger and effectively making it robust and
Ah, vai, non ti
immutable.
preoccupare,
In the
Gabri,
case
anzi,
of
grazie che
Bitcoin,
ci hai provato. Se
it's
riuscite, ragazzi,
computational work,
ricondividete il
which
link, perché in
does
questo
that
momento
same
qua
thing.
probabilmente
Now,
con
a
la
lot of
connessione
people
non
say,
potentissima
well,
che
why
ho,
can't we just
fa
strip the
difficoltà
proof of
riuscire a
work
tenere aperte sia
out
la
of
streaming che
Bitcoin
il
and
video.
insert a
Visto comunque
system
se
like
vedo
proof
che
of
va
stake?
abbastanza bene,
Well, if you were to do
non
that,
mi si apre purtroppo la
in proof
chat,
of
quindi non
stake, you
riesco a
would
condividervelo.
create
Se
influence
riuscite a
proportional to the
ricondividere il
number
link
of
che ho
coins
condiviso
held. In the
all'inizio,
case of
vi
Bitcoin,
ringrazio
that would make these
tantissimo.
large
Comunque dovrebbe essere
custodians,
nella chat, quindi se
banks,
scorrete verso l'alto lo
effectively, that
trovate.
control
E alle
lots
ore
of
8,
coins
ripeto
on
sempre,
behalf
ci
of
sarà Elon
users.
Musk che
It
fa
would
il
make
suo
them the
intervento.
stewards of the network. It would give them effective control. And unfortunately, it's the case today that many, a large fraction of all the outstanding Bitcoins are controlled by these custodians. And so if you were to eliminate the proof of work process and impose something like proof of stake, or delegate control to these third-party validators with a lot of influence, you would lose the nice assurances. You would lose the decentralization of the network effectively. So as far as we know, proof of work provides pretty unique assurances that aren't recaptured by any alternative system. So as I mentioned before, proof of work has a couple different functions. One of them is to mediate the initial issuance of new Bitcoins. And it's interestingly the fact that
Volete che alzo un po' il
historically,
volume? Si
the
sente
vast
bene?
majority of
Lo alzo un
Bitcoin's
pochettino?
energy expenditure derives from this issuance. So miners are compensated in two
Ecco, questi
ways.
qua,
One
fatti
is
spese, sono
through
tutti quanti
the
grafici
collection of
delle
new units of
spese
Bitcoin,
giornaliere
and then the
derivanti dal
second
consumo e dalla
is through
produzione di
fees that
Bitcoin, anche
users
degli
attach to
scambi, quindi anche
transactions.
semplicemente quando noi facciamo uno
But
scambio tra un
historically,
wallet e un
the
altro,
issuance of
produciamo
new
delle
units
energie
of
e questa
Bitcoin
energia è
has
stata tutta
dominated their
calcolata tramite
revenue.
questi grafici.
It's been over 90% of their revenue historically, with transaction fees being much more minor. And
Ragazzi,
so
tra
when you
l'altro ho
think
visto
about
un
the energy
commento che
consumption
non è
of the Bitcoin
proprio
system,
carinissimo, nel
this is
senso
really
purtroppo me
critical
lo banna
because you have to
YouTube, quindi
decompose
occhio alle parole che
transactional
utilizzate,
intensity
però ho
from
capito
miner
il
revenue
concetto.
and hence energy spend. It's not the case that adding more transactions will dramatically increase the energy expenditure of the Bitcoin network, as a lot of people mistakenly believe. Most of the energy consumption is really a function of the price of Bitcoin and, of course, the value of that new issuance that miners are collecting. That's really what's going to drive the energy consumption over the next few years, not the number of transactions. Bitcoin can scale up the number of transactions or the value of transactions without really having a linear proportional effect on the amount of energy that miners are consuming. So it's really, in the near and medium term, much more a function of the price of Bitcoin and the value of the new reward that miners are incurring. And this is kind of analogous to gold again. You shouldn't think of Bitcoin's energy dynamics as analogous to something like Visa. You should think of it as similar to gold, where the vast majority of the energy expended by gold production, manufacturing, extraction, has to do with mining the gold, pulling it out of the ground and refining it. It has much less to do with moving the gold on trucks or boats or anything like that. It's kind of similar with Bitcoin. Most of the energy outlay in Bitcoin's case is a function of the initial creation of Bitcoins. And so that's a key thing to remember, because gold is this useful commodity that people use to store their wealth outside the confines of the state. The extraction of gold is kind of tolerated, even if it's not particularly ecological.
Ti ringrazio Paolo,
and the same thing with Bitcoin. The production of Bitcoin is, still, yields and provides us with a system which is of value to society. And so it's still, something that we should accommodate effectively. Now, let's just sort of set the table and actually look at some of the numbers here. So as of today, and there is some uncertainty with all these numbers, a lot of them are estimates. We can't have perfect direct knowledge of all these things because miners are kind of hard to get data from. It's this global set of entities that we can't necessarily triangulate all of who they are. But, based on the kind of state-of-the-art knowledge we have today, Bitcoin miners consume about a quarter of 1%
Facciamo una prova tutti insieme, se ho
of all
sbagliato
the
qualcosa
world's
ragazzi chiedo
electricity.
scusa. Allora, ok, bene, si può mettere pausa, spero che non ci perdiamo niente. Allora, praticamente quello che abbiamo visto fino adesso sono stati dei piccoli, numeri per quanto riguarda, che fondamentalmente già conosciamo, quello che riguarda il consumo derivato da derivante appunto dall'utilizzo e dallo scambio della moneta Bitcoin. Questo qua invece è tutto il numero di miner che sono appunto presenti ad oggi nel mondo per quanto riguarda Bitcoin. Infatti qui sulla destra vediamo delle comparazioni di USA, cinesi appunto a livello globale, che riguarda anche noi occidentali e quant'altro. Quindi diciamo è tutto quello che poi viene poi effettivamente incanalato per quanto riguarda il consumo di CO2, le emissioni, il vario consumo energetico e quant'altro. Insomma, rispetto a quello che più o meno possiamo leggere su internet, sono degli approfondimenti appunto riguardo appunto il consumo e l'utilizzo di appunto Bitcoin.
And about 1/10 of 1% of all the world's energy production, because the world produces a lot more energy than it does mere electricity. And so that's kind of where we are. And whether you think that's really high or really low has to do with your view of sort of the merits of Bitcoin, whether it's a worthwhile thing or not. Now, in terms of the actual composition of the energy inputs, that gets much more tricky to assess, because we have to determine whether miners are actually using renewable or non-renewable sources. It's kind of hard to know, right? It's difficult to just ask the miners. So the various estimates we have historically, Cambridge in 2020 ascertained that miners were around 39% renewable. More recent studies, the Bitcoin Mining Council, which is this group of North American and other miners, came out with some disclosures earlier this year, and they found that within that sample, the sustainability of miner operations was around 67%. If you combine that with a conservative assumption for the default energy mix for the world for the out-of-sample data, you get a figure of around 46% sustainable. Now, sustainable means renewable plus nuclear in this instance. And so that's probably better than the global average grid. Now, it's, again, a lot of that is guesswork, and we won't really know what the true sustainability of Bitcoin mining is until we get a better idea of where miners are. But our best guess is that Bitcoin is responsible for around 50 megatons of CO2 emissions per year, or around 1/10 of 1% of the world's emissions. Now, what does this actually mean? I mean, what does this compare to? So you can compare it to individual small countries, as is very commonly done, or you can understand that the world is this sort of highly globalized place, and that for the most part, we outsource our industrial capacity to one or two major countries, which account for the vast majority of sort of energy production and consumption. So Bitcoin's current energy usage is around 0.7% of China's energy production and between 1% to 2% of America's. And so it just really depends, how you want to compare it to the global consumers of energy. Bitcoin's energy footprint is 12 times smaller than always-on devices in U.S. households. It's 15 times less than electricity lost in transit globally every year.
Diciamo, allora, questa cosa qua è abbastanza importante, dobbiamo un attimino, faccio una piccola precisazione, fatemi sapere anche se così vi potrebbe essere utile una cosa del genere durante la live. Se invece non la preferite, evito di farla più avanti. Però è molto importante perché fino ad oggi, diciamo, anche secondo quello che ha detto Elon Musk, con Bitcoin, l'estrazione di Bitcoin e quant'altro stiamo inquinando. In realtà abbiamo visto che, appunto dal grafico di prima, da quello che ha spiegato questo ragazzo, che il consumo di Bitcoin ad oggi mondiale consuma solo lo 0,26% del consumo mondiale di elettricità. Quindi se la vediamo in termini più vasti, appunto, e non ci fermiamo su quello che sono le piccole percentuali di un piccolo stato o comunque sia di una nazione, capiamo che sono veramente numeri infinitesimali rispetto a quello che appunto consumiamo. E appunto in quest'altra parte lui specifica che è 12 volte, cioè l'energia utilizzata e consumata per estrarre e per fare Bitcoin da tutti gli stati è 12 volte più piccola rispetto a qualsiasi elettrodomestico noi abbiamo all'interno della nostra casa, e 15 volte più piccolo rispetto a tutte le transazioni che vengono fatte ogni anno. Quindi in realtà tutto questo consumo che c'è effettivamente, tutto questo, diciamo, guardare male il consumo che viene fatto tramite Bitcoin è forse un pochettino insensato. Quindi secondo me è anche molto interessante, ecco, appunto, poter vedere effettivamente tutti quanti questi numeri.
And now I think industry level comparisons are much more elucidating than country levels, because Bitcoin is not a country, it's an industry, right? It's an industry that provides monetary assurances, transactions, and savings. And so this industry analysis is not that commonly done, because typically, as far as policy is concerned, we're much more...
Scusate, rimetto in pausa perché Pollux mi ha detto prima che non si sente bene quando parlo io e quando c'è anche giustamente di sottofondo il ragazzo che parla, però per quanto riguarda le previsioni è un po' presto secondo me riuscire a fare, diciamo, come posso dire, una previsione esatta, perché purtroppo siamo a parte l'inizio della conferenza, vedremo forse i risultati, non dico domani, ma forse dopodomani, e probabilmente se Musk tra qualche mese, tra qualche tempo, dovesse effettivamente riaccettare i pagamenti con Bitcoin, cosa che potrebbe effettivamente sussistere dal momento che lui i suoi Bitcoin non li ha venduti tutti, allora a quel punto sicuramente potremmo vedere un'altra volta una corsa, però anche lì, no? Nel senso, il mio ragionamento è quello, effettivamente le persone si fidano ancora di quello che dice Musk? Perché ultimamente, nel senso, purtroppo ha dato parecchio da dover pensare, sia con Dogecoin, sia con Bitcoin, insomma, tante cose sono state, appunto, secondo me, buttate troppo lì alla casaccio. Vedremo effettivamente, secondo me, alla fine di questo, diciamo, di questa live, tutto quanto, potremmo vedere un piccolo rialzo. Tutto quanto però, secondo me, secondo il mio modesto parere, dipenderà anche dall'intervento che ci sarà, non soltanto da parte di Musk, ma anche dall'intervento che ci sarà appunto da ARK Invest, che comunque sia Katie punta tantissimo su Bitcoin, cioè ha reinvestito non so quanti soldi anche adesso ad aprile, quindi probabilmente, ripeto, secondo il mio modesto parere, potremmo vedere un rialzo, ma non sarà un rialzo così tanto considerevole.
More concerned with, well, what's the nature of the grid? How sustainable is the grid? But you
Grazie
can
a voi
certainly
ragazzi
look
e
at
ragazze che
individual
mi state seguendo.
sources of energy consumption, and you can compare them to Bitcoin if you want. So there's all sorts of numbers here. Bitcoin is, slightly less than the amount of energy consumed just by domestic tumble dryers globally. And of course, a tumble dryer is a discretionary thing. You can always dry your clothes on the line if you want, but it improves our quality of life. So we accept the fact that it consumes some energy. Bitcoin compares favorably with the energy used by copper mining, zinc mining, gold mining. Those all, as far as we can tell, have a greater energy impact. Now, that's not to say that those industries aren't useful. I mean, they provide, genuinely useful metals. This is just to contextualize Bitcoin so you can compare it to other industry level uses of energy. And, a lot of these industries, whether it's refrigeration, air conditioning, heating, tumble dryers, washing machines, they massively improve our quality of life. So we don't often think that critically about the energy requirements of those industries because they brought us into modernity. I mean, they represent the trappings of civilization. Air conditioning meant that we could live in hotter places to live more comfortably. So we don't regret the energy that's used on them, the same way that we shouldn't regret the energy used for this novel monetary transmission technology. This is just the mark of civilizational progress, obtaining more energy and then putting it to use in sort of efficient sources that make our lives better. So just to summarize that section, I mean, the perceived merit of an application's energy consumption is really ultimately a function of your own subjective view of that application's utility, right? And so if you don't believe a certain application has utility, you're going to believe that the energy associated with it is a waste. And certainly a lot of people don't believe that gold is, has a role in modern society. Certainly many people don't believe that Bitcoin does. But, things like gold is a means of storing your wealth outside the banking system, outside the state. Equivalently, so is Bitcoin in a way that's, has completely differentiated qualities from these other monetary systems. So to the extent Bitcoin has utility, to the extent we acknowledge it has utility, its energy consumption becomes much more tractable and something that we can get more comfortable with. Satoshi, mentioned this before, saying, gold mining is a waste.
Sezione, Alessandro, ti devi
gold itself.
Per quanto riguarda la sezione quella di Elon Musk, entrando nel link che ho messo dentro la chat, è la seconda sezione, quella dove appunto ci sta anche appunto le varie immagini di Katie, di Elon Musk e di Squeeza, anche dovrebbe esserci.
Facilitates these new transactions that wouldn't be possible without it, so it's not a net waste. And similarly with Bitcoin, the issuance of Bitcoin and the energy associated with that allows us to have Bitcoin, which provides these interesting monetary assurances to tens of millions of people worldwide. And if you look on sort of a per capita basis, and other talks I'm sure will cover this today, we're talking about disproportionate penetration in places with weak property rights, poor governance, high inflation, strong capital controls, places where people are very unfree from a monetary perspective. And so, you know, not everyone watching this talk will be in a situation like that. Bitcoin may not be that relevant to them. But rest assured, you know, the highest Bitcoin penetration is in places like Argentina, Venezuela, Turkey, Nigeria, Kenya. These are places where the independent system of property rights proposed by Bitcoin is extremely relevant to these people. So the good news is that Bitcoin mining, unlike gold mining, which requires, you know, sifting earth and refining gold and smelting it down.
Allora, guarda Loriana, purtroppo l'ho detto, alle 8 non credo di riuscire a rimanere in live per poter seguire effettivamente il discorso di Elon Musk. Se ci riesco, molto volentieri, però purtroppo non penso di riuscirci.
Bitcoin mining is pretty much a synthetic process. All you're really doing is using computational work to search a mathematical space. And because it's synthetic, that means that mining itself can be as green as the energy inputs that the miners are relying on. And so that's pretty good news. It means that as the grid gets more sustainable over time, which we certainly expect it to, mining itself will become greener. And if you expect this transition will occur and renewables will continue to dominate and the grids, generally speaking, will decarbonize, Bitcoin can completely benefit from this. And so
in questo, diciamo, grafico qua lui sta praticamente facendo semplicemente riferimento al fatto che appunto sono state dette tante cose, tra cui appunto quello che abbiamo visto prima, che il fatto che Bitcoin consumi tantissimo e produca tantissimo, diciamo, CO2 e tantissimo appunto consumo di elettricità. In realtà appunto quello che loro stanno dicendo è che Bitcoin, essendo una cosa informatica, di base può cambiare, perché quello che gli interessa è semplicemente dover avere un impulso elettrico, mentre invece ad esempio l'estrazione dell'oro, che già ad oggi, che non è comunque sia completamente green il sistema di Bitcoin, già ad oggi il consumo dell'oro è 7 volte, come abbiamo visto nel grafico di prima, 7 volte superiore al consumo per quanto riguarda l'estrazione di un Bitcoin o comunque sia di Bitcoin in generale. Quindi il gold, quindi l'oro in questo caso, come dice, anzi non potrà mai essere effettivamente green, anche se uno vorrà cercare di farlo, perché tanto per estrarlo quello serve fare, quindi un buco nel terreno e cercarlo. Per quanto riguarda Bitcoin, essendo che ci serve soltanto un impulso elettrico per poterlo avere, ci basterà semplicemente appunto dover trasformare quell'impulso elettrico che noi ad oggi otteniamo tramite un consumo di, non so, una batteria, appunto tramite il consumo di elettricità diretta, come anche energia nucleare, potremmo invece doverla utilizzare semplicemente tramite appunto le pale eoliche, quindi tutte quante quelle che sono le energie green e rinnovabili che ci sono ad oggi. Questo ovviamente porterà, nel terzo grafico che leggiamo, tantissimi benefici a lungo termine per quello che sarà appunto l'utilizzo stesso di questa moneta virtuale rispetto alle monete appunto fisiche.
In 20 years time, when grids are green, it could well be the case that Bitcoin has fully sustainable production. The other good piece of news is that Bitcoin is this highly modularizable industry where Bitcoin miners don't necessarily have to be in one place or another, so they can shuttle back and forth and disproportionately procure these sustainable energy sources. So it's you could say it's location independent. Unlike a lot of other industries, Bitcoin consumes energy regardless of where that energy is produced. And of course, this is different from, say, household energy production, where energy has to be produced relatively nearby to load centers because it has losses in transmission. Another historical analogy here would be aluminum smelting. So aluminum can be smelted sort of in a location independent basis. And this is why you had lots of aluminum smelting in places like Iceland with abundant hydro energy. Of course, that required lots of installed infrastructure. So aluminum couldn't perfectly facilitate this energy arbitrage, but Bitcoin can. Bitcoin can be mined with as little as a shipping container full of ASICs. And so it can disproportionately penetrate those places with cheap and abundant electricity. And in many cases, that's renewable. So historically, this is why Bitcoin miners were disproportionately located in China, because China had the most abundant stranded hydro resources on the planet. China was curtailing 50 to 70 terawatt hours of hydro energy, so simply not being delivered to the grid. In 2016, 2017, that's why Bitcoin miners went to those southern provinces in China. So the world doesn't necessarily produce precisely the right amount of energy needed that the grid demands. Oftentimes there's imbalances, and Bitcoin can exploit those imbalances effectively. Wind and solar are a classic example of technologies that don't necessarily generate energy in a way that's suitable for the grid to consume them. You don't necessarily have large suitable solar plants in places that are right adjacent to cities, for instance. And so you see lots and lots of wind and solar curtailment, basically energy that doesn't reach the grid. Now, they don't generate energy in a profile that is suitable for Bitcoin mining today because they're intermittent sources. But as battery technology improves, and I think we can all agree that it is generally improving, they will become smoother in terms of their generation profile and thus more suitable for Bitcoin miners. So that'll be more of a medium-term trend. Lastly, globally speaking, the extraction of hydrocarbons is always associated with the production of waste and natural gas. And that gas effectively gets flared or vented off because it's not economical to make it to the market. Now, Bitcoin miners have begun to take advantage of this flared gas and effectively capture it and turn it into energy to mine Bitcoin with. And now that gas was being flared anyway. So from a carbon perspective, it's completely net neutral. So Bitcoin can take advantage of all of these sources of curtailed, stranded, or non-rival, which is to say energy sources which would not compete with load centers with commercial or household demand for energy. And so this location independence is an incredibly powerful trait for Bitcoin. The other interesting thing is that Bitcoin miners are synergistic with grids that are more renewable in their nature. And this is obviously happening as policymakers
Ragazzi, fatemi sapere sotto, ovviamente nei commenti, se c'è qualcosa che non va, qualcosa che magari non vi è chiaro, però diciamo per ora quello che sta dicendo appunto lui sono cose abbastanza risapute, quindi probabilmente la parte interessante, il grosso dell'intervento sarà interessante vederlo alle ore 20, però adesso questo piccolo ripasso, ripeto, un pochettino più approfondito di quello che sta effettivamente succedendo in questo momento con la transizione da energie elettriche che utilizziamo ad oggi, energie rinnovabili, è molto interessante.
Prioritize the sustainability of grids. There's just more and more wind and solar that we're seeing part of energy grids. And now an interesting thing about Bitcoin miners is that they represent interruptible load, which means that they can scale down their demand very rapidly and on short notice. So they're perfectly eligible to participate and really suitable for these things called demand response programs, which means that when a grid is very much overtaxed and demand starts to approach or exceed the supply, miners can be part of this industrial cohort that spins down their operations and turns off on short notice. Now, most sources on the supply side of energy cannot spin up or down on short notice. Certainly thermal energy can't spin up or down. So one way to deal with imbalances in supply and demand is to make the demand side more flexible. And so Bitcoin miners are perfect for that, effectively turning down the demand at times of peak load. And if you look at the Texas demand response program, they asked you to turn off your consumption with 10 minutes or 30 minutes notice. Miners can do this. Other sources of demand have a much harder time doing this. So this actually is a counter-cyclical feature. The miners buy the energy when supply is abundant, and they stop buying the energy when households really need it, when things get extremely constrained on the grid. And so that has this net effect of actually balancing out the grid, and I'm sure we'll see much more of that as more hash rate comes online to the US. The other thing is that Bitcoin miners are a buyer of first resort for new energy projects that aren't yet grid connected. So if you're building a renewable project and it's going to take some time to integrate it into the grid, miners can be a short-term buyer of that energy and effectively improve the financials of that project. So a lot of people say that miners are a subsidy, or Bitcoin is a subsidy for renewable energy. That may or may not be the case, but certainly the presence of Bitcoin miners in a grid, especially one that's rendered more unstable by the presence of renewables, which are more intermittent in their generation profile, the miners can actually attenuate that intermittency and actually enhance grid stability.
Bitcoin miners are
so the good news again is there's been a significant focus on the sustainability of Bitcoin mining, rightfully so, but the Bitcoin mining community has absolutely reacted, and we're seeing rapid progress being made towards sustainability. There's a lot happening here. I'll summarize some of the new elements. So first of all, an enormous amount of Bitcoin's hash rate previously was domiciled in China, but that hash rate was very much exposed to these carbon-intense sources of energy generation, especially in Inner Mongolia and Xinjiang provinces. In certain portions of the year, you'd get 45% of global's entire hash rate being powered by these two provinces, which were 60 to 70% coal powered in their electricity generation. So during those periods, almost 50% of Bitcoin's hash rate was dominated by these very much coal powered provinces in China. Now, since May of 2021, China has effectively banned Bitcoin mining in the country. And so around 50 to almost 60% of Bitcoin's hash rate has been eliminated from China. It's looking for new homes overseas. We're still in that period where those miners are looking for new hosting. But what that means is that effective reliance on coal-based generation in China has now been eliminated. And of course, there's coal production in other countries like Iran and Kazakhstan, where we know mining occurs, but a lot of those miners are looking for homes in politically stable countries like the US, where the grids are much more renewable. And so the net effect of this migration from Inner Mongolia, Xinjiang, to places like Texas or the PJM grid in New York, New Jersey, or Canada, British Columbia, or Northern Europe, places where miners are already active, that's going to have the net effect of reducing the carbon intensity of that mining activity. And this was an enormous shakeup in the Bitcoin mining space. So we're seeing this migration happening. We're going to need some more time to see where the miners settle, but most likely this is going to reduce the carbon intensity of the Bitcoin network. Next up, as miners become more Western-based as they undergo this migration, they're also becoming more transparent. And this is a reaction to some of the media attention that we've seen on the industry. And I think it's a warranted reaction. So the Bitcoin Mining Council is just one of a number of initiatives to increase transparency around what miners are doing and where their energy is deriving from. So their first disclosure in Q2 of this year assembled 32% of all of the active hash rate, and they found within that sample a 67% sustainability. And they're making quarterly disclosures on an ongoing basis. So I'm sure that we'll see more of this. I'm very optimistic about the quality of these disclosures. And ultimately, this is just going to provide investors and onlookers and academics and policymakers more information regarding what the miners are actually doing. Of course, we can't solve this problem overnight, but simply providing people the informational tools to understand where these miners are and what their actual energy mix is and what their associated carbon intensity is, that's going to dramatically help here. And some of these miners are actually engaging in the buying of carbon offsets as well. And that's not a perfect solution, but some of them have committed to becoming completely net neutral by pursuing as sustainable sources of energy as they can and buying offsets for the remainder. Now, this is...
Tra l'altro, effettivamente all'inizio del video non l'ho fatto vedere, dato questo qua appunto ripeto della diretta, questi qua sono i relatori di questa parte, di questa prima parte di conferenza. Nick Carter, che è quello ragazzo che sta parlando adesso, poi avremo Philip, poi avremo Arjun, Nate e Lynn alla fine. Nel senso, so che possono sembrare nomi abbastanza sconosciuti, ma in realtà no, posso garantirvelo.
This is another consequence of miners being public and being exposed to Western capital markets. Increasingly, and we know this is a priority of financial regulators in this country, ESG concerns are a big portion of what these public market agendas involve. So as capital becomes more accountable to Western capital markets, it has a strong incentive to be more sustainable in nature, because increasingly we're seeing the cost of capital rise for firms that fall far outside the norm in terms of sustainability. And so miners now have an additional financial incentive to pursue more sustainable operations. And as miners move from China to the US, that incentive is going to grow. So we know that they're more insensitive these days. And Western miners, we've just seen more disclosure from them and more proactivity from them. So to summarize, this migration of hash rate from east to west is leading to a more accountable, more known, more identifiable, and more sustainable body of miners. And so, of course, it's still early days, and we don't have a complete informational picture regarding the sustainability of the Bitcoin network. But the trends look extremely positive. And at the end of the day, this is an industry that provides a significant value and utility to tens of millions of people worldwide. And so I think the prospects for Bitcoin mining are bright. And I thank you for attending my talk and listening to my presentation.
Grazie a te, Nick. Allora, questa prima parte di presentazione quindi ce l'ha fatta Nick ed è tutto appunto quello che ci interessava sul Bitcoin, come spreca energia e con quale appunto facilità riusciamo a magari riuscire a migrare verso un'energia un pochettino più sostenibile. Questa seconda parte invece sarà la facilità dell'attività criminale, cioè per tutte quante quelle attività poco lecite che si stanno svolgendo in questo momento su proprio Bitcoin. Avanti un pochettino perché sennò sono 8 ore e mezza.
Hello, I'm Philip Gradwell, the Chief Economist at Chainalysis, and today I'm here to address a major myth around Bitcoin, and that is that it facilitates criminal activity. Bitcoin has a really mysterious aura around it. It's an exciting new technology with an anonymous creator that promises to revolutionize money, and so potentially even society. But part of the mystery also comes from how many people, first heard about Bitcoin. The Silk Road, operating between 2011 and 2013, was the first place that people could really use Bitcoin. But the Silk Road was a darknet marketplace, a website where you could buy and sell drugs. So the first time that Bitcoin entered the public consciousness, it was related to criminal activity. And that was my personal journey. And I want to share that journey to dispel the myth that Bitcoin facilitates.
Ok, lui sta iniziando veramente il discorso dicendo appunto che nel momento in cui Bitcoin era un pochettino mistico, quindi non era ancora ben conosciuto, la maggior parte delle persone credeva che fosse appunto un'attività criminale volta a rubare i soldi, quando invece in realtà poi nel tempo effettivamente Bitcoin si è rivelato un ottimo investimento e appunto molto trasparente. Però nonostante questo ad oggi c'è lo stesso qualcuno che continua a insinuare e a dire questa cosa, quindi che sia poco affidabile tutto il resto, e ovviamente tramite questi grafici che lui ha riusciamo a vedere appunto quanto è trasparente, quanto è misurabile la sua sicurezza e soprattutto quanto è tracciabile le varie, appunto, quante sono tracciabili effettivamente i vari scambi di criptovalute che si possono essere tra un fiat wallet e l'investimento stesso in cripto.
Criminal activity. But first, to just say how you can dispel that myth, there are just 3 facts to remember. The first is that Bitcoin, due to its public blockchain, brings unprecedented transparency to economic activity. The second is that due to that transparency, criminal activity on Bitcoin can be measured. The data shows that illicit entities accounted for just 2% of all economic activity on Bitcoin in 2020, a figure that just cannot be calculated for fiat. So 98% of activity, the vast majority, is legal. And third, Bitcoin's transparency also means that criminal activity can be traced and stopped. To give an example of that, when the US Department of Justice announced the takedown of the largest child pornography darknet market site in October 2019, they said law enforcement was able to trace payments of Bitcoin to the darknet site by following the flow of funds on the blockchain. And it's not just law enforcement. Cryptocurrency businesses around the world perform anti-money laundering checks using blockchain data to meet their regulatory obligations to
Elon,
disrupt criminal
ci sarà alle
activity.
ore 20.
Due to its transparency, Bitcoin has good, if
Tra l'altro, visto comunque sia che me l'avete chiesto, siccome io probabilmente per le 20 non riuscirò ad essere effettivamente diciamo live qui con voi, direi in diretta, però posso effettivamente fare una cosa, lasciare la live andare avanti e commentare insieme a voi tramite la chat. Fatemi sapere sotto cosa ne pensate, se vi potrebbe interessare una cosa del genere, oppure se preferite ovviamente vedervelo tramite il link che vi ho dato.
not better ways of combating criminal activity than fiat. So what is the personal journey that has led me to understand that it is a myth that Bitcoin facilitates criminal activity? I'm the chief economist at Chainalysis, a company that analyzes blockchain data to promote more financial freedom with less risk. Cryptocurrency businesses, law enforcement, and financial institutions use our software and data to manage the risks of criminal use of Bitcoin, as well as to identify the legitimate opportunities. So when law enforcement were tracing payments to that child pornography site I mentioned,
Dai,
they were
ragazzi,
using
allora va bene,
Chainalysis
faremo in
software.
questo modo. Grazie a tutti quanti per il feedback.
But my Bitcoin journey started with the Silk Road, although perhaps not how you might think. I'm an economist, so when I read about the Silk Road on the internet, I was blown away by the way in which Bitcoin was facilitating new types of economic interactions. Now, on the Silk Road, those interactions were
Grazie,
illegal,
ragazzi.
but it demonstrated to me the potential of Bitcoin to transform all of our economic activity. In the years since then, I've been on a mission to accurately understand how Bitcoin is actually used by analyzing data on the blockchain. By 2021, both our ability to understand how Bitcoin is used and the way it is used
Questo
has
ci
been
incollo il microfono,
transformed.
gli regalo io.
As this chart shows, the vast majority of Bitcoin activity is currently trading and investment. The chart shows the source on the left-hand side and the destination on the right-hand side
Aspetta, lo rimetto in
of
chat il
Bitcoin that is
link.
transferred on the blockchain over the last 12 months. The largest flows are between self-hosted wallets. These range from Bitcoin sent from the wallet I have
Ecco
on
il
my
link.
phone to Bitcoin held by large institutional investors who custody their own Bitcoin. The next largest flows are to, from, and between exchanges, where people trade Bitcoin for fiat currencies or other cryptocurrencies. And as you can see, illicit entities account for a very small amount of the flows compared to these other use cases, small enough that I've had to highlight them on this graph. And what are these illicit entities? They are the Bitcoin addresses that are controlled by people undertaking criminal activities, such as running darknet markets, scams, or ransomware. And I'll describe these further shortly. But first, I want to give you a sense of the overall scale of criminal activity that occurs on Bitcoin.
Ecco qua per esempio questo grafico qua vi ha analizzato il fatto che di tanto quello che dicono effettivamente, tante cose che vengono dette, in realtà soltanto il 2% degli account hanno utilizzato per attività illecite, mettiamola così, per attività criminali, la criptovaluta Bitcoin, quindi solo il 2% di tutto quello che è disponibile ad oggi, che comunque è comunque una buona somma, parliamone, però diciamo è sempre molto ridotta. Se la vediamo in percentuale è poca, poi se quella percentuale la vai a trasmigrare effettivamente in quantità, in quantitativo, capisci che probabilmente già qualcuno ci ha messo il naso su sta cosa, su questa possibilità.
You can see on this chart that criminal activity accounted for around 2% of all the economic activity on
Potrebbe
Bitcoin
essere
in
un'idea,
2020.
Lino.
And we see some quite large absolute numbers in terms of the dollar value of criminal activity,
Grazie, Adri,
to
lascerò
$10
live
billion
allora.
in 2020. But you've got to understand that
Io
these are
ovviamente
actually quite
risponderò con
small
voi
relative
tramite i
to criminal
commenti della
activity
live
in the fiat
stessa,
economy.
anche perché probabilmente non sarò
In fact, in the fiat
presente proprio
economy, it's very
fisicamente.
difficult to
Vi lascerò però
understand
la
the
live
level of criminal
accesa.
activity because you can't see the transactions that are occurring and you can't measure it. But there's certainly more than $10 billion of criminal activity occurring. But the level of criminal activity is actually very small relative to the Bitcoin economy. As I showed on the previous chart, there's so much more use cases of Bitcoin going on than just criminal activity. And that is why the overall share of illicit activity on Bitcoin is just 2% in 2020. Now, of course, it was higher in previous years. We see that spike in 2019. And that was actually due to some scams that were particularly successful. I'm going to talk about them more shortly. It's also just important to understand that these numbers are a lower bound and they do change over time. And that's really for two reasons. We identify more criminal activity over
Sono
time,
d'accordo
so that
con
means the
te,
numerator
zio.
gets bigger.
Occhio ai
And we also
ritracciamenti.
remove more noise from our estimates of economic activity on the blockchain. And so the denominator gets smaller. But overall, the key thing to understand is that, yes, there is some criminal activity on Bitcoin, but it's a small amount. And as I'll explain later, there are also ways in which it can be stopped. But I also want to talk about the types of criminal activity that does occur. And when we break this down, as we are on this chart here, we see that most of the criminal activity on Bitcoin is related to scams and darknet markets, with an increase in ransom.
Nel 2019 è stato l'anno in cui le attività criminali hanno utilizzato, cioè insomma, sono stati utilizzati Bitcoin maggiormente per attività illecite. Il 2018 è quello in cui sono riusciti a fare, diciamo, meglio. Il 2019 tra l'altro, tanto per essere, allora questa qua è la parte del darknet market, quella giallo, il resto quello verde invece è la parte dello scam, quindi per cosa è stato utilizzato effettivamente queste attività criminali. E ovviamente poi verranno bloccati, con questa saranno stati bloccati già questi soldi che sono stati, diciamo, rubati, perché come ha detto questo ragazzo, è vero che è sempre una piccola percentuale, è vero anche che esiste sempre questa piccola percentuale di persone che hanno utilizzato in maniera illecita Bitcoin, però è anche vero allo stesso modo che loro riescono in qualche modo a bloccarlo, nonostante tutto che le transazioni siano, diciamo, abbastanza mascherate, nascoste, loro riescono comunque a bloccarlo.
Somewhere in 2020.
Tanto fatemi sapere secondo
And
voi in che
these are
modo,
serious
perché in questo
crimes,
momento qua non riesco
which
a
is why,
pensarci
in my
per nulla.
view, for Bitcoin to go mainstream, we need to measure, trace, and stop criminal activity. For example, through law enforcement action, regulation, and anti-money laundering requirements. But another key insight from this is the prevalence of
Così si vede
scams.
meglio la parte del grafico. Ci sono
They
delle parti molto
demonstrate the
piccole.
need for a strong community and some good faith efforts to inform
Fatto, zio,
people
messo.
about the right opportunities. Bitcoin contains so many get-rich-quick true stories
Sono
that it's
d'accordo,
so
Gabri,
easy
esisterà
for
sempre
new
qualcuno
people
che ci
entering
vuole
the
fregare.
space to be sucked in by a scam. So the more that we educate people, the more we can actually tackle this major source of crime. And I believe that the entry of more mainstream organizations that can guide people towards genuine investment opportunities, the smaller this risk of activity there will be. So while there is some serious criminal activity on Bitcoin, it's relatively small and a lot of it is concentrated in scams that can be reduced through greater education and community action. But law enforcement and also cryptocurrency businesses through their anti-money laundering programs are already fighting criminal activity today, and they're actually achieving great success. I'm showing here just a few examples of the law enforcement actions that make it out into the public, and there are many more successful ones happening behind the scenes.
Questi sono tutti quanti i casi in cui sono riusciti a bloccare
And
le
from the
varie
perspective
attività
we've had at Chain
criminali.
Analysis, working with our law enforcement partners, we've really understood that actually enforcing against criminal activity on the blockchain is sometimes actually easier than it is in the fiat world. Because of
Concordo
the
anche su
quality of the
questa
data and the
ultima
ability to
affermazione
follow
che
the
non posso
money
ripetere per ovvi
without getting
motivi.
stuck in shell companies and jurisdictions that you can't access data on, as you do in the fiat world.
Però ecco, diciamo, facendo una piccola precisazione, quello che viene visto nel grafico di prima e quello anche appunto possiamo leggere tramite questi articoli che lui ha riportato come casi di successo in cui loro sono riusciti effettivamente a bloccare, è effettivamente vero che viene, per carità, utilizzato anche in parte per quello che il nostro caro zio della chat ha scritto, Però è anche vero allo stesso modo che c'è stata tantissima gente che l'ha utilizzato proprio per fottere, mettiamola così, per frodare, ecco, molto più tecnico come termine, per frodare, diciamo, tantissimi anche istituti, diciamo, appunto come vediamo qua, la parte della, cioè, del governo russo, cioè, ma che cavolo ti viene in mente di provare a rubare al governo russo? Ma io lo dico, boh.
Our law enforcement partners have actually managed to do much larger investigations
Io
using
ancora no, Alessio, perché ho tutto
collaborating
il staking
with
su
law enforcement agencies
crypto.com.
across the world
Poi
at a
inizio a
much
utilizzare
greater
anche lo
speed
Shiba
than they would
Swap.
have otherwise been able to do. And another key driver that is controlling the use of Bitcoin for criminal activity is an increasingly strong regulatory framework. People have the misconception that Bitcoin isn't regulated. In fact, because of its
Vero, c'è
early
molta
history,
ignoranza.
its
Comunque alle
use
ore
on the
20
Silk Road,
c'è Elon Musk.
Bitcoin has been under regulatory scrutiny almost from the start. And Bitcoin often falls under traditional existing regulatory frameworks. And over recent years, there's been an enormous amount of effort to build up a more comprehensive regulatory framework specifically for the asset. For example, the Financial Action Task Force, which sets global recommendations for anti-money laundering, has a cryptocurrency framework, and a number of important financial jurisdictions have developed their own cryptocurrency regulations. And so the combination of the transparency of the blockchain, the success of identifying and tracing and stopping criminal activity, and the strong regulatory framework really helps reduce the amount of illicit activity on Bitcoin. And as I've emphasized, there's just a huge amount of data available on the criminal activity and just how it compares to the other far more numerous and positive use cases of Bitcoin. If you want to learn more, at Chainalysis, we have a wealth of information on our blog. But to summarize, really with Bitcoin, you've got to remember whenever someone says, I think it facilitates criminal activity, you should tell them that actually, because the blockchain is public and therefore transparent, we can actually measure the amount of criminal activity that's going on, which you simply cannot do at fiat. And in 2020, it was around 2% of overall economic activity, leaving 98% to more legal, interesting, productive uses. And because of that transparency, it's possible to trace and stop that criminal activity through law enforcement action and anti-money laundering regulations. So thank you very much. I've been Philip Bradwell, Chief Economist at Chainalysis.
Ok, questo qua diciamo appunto era tutta la parte quindi dell'attività criminale che era stata svolta, che è stata svolta negli anni tramite appunto la criptovaluta Bitcoin. Intanto mandiamo avanti questo qui perché sennò siamo 8 ore e mezza. Oh, eccoci già, siamo arrivati. Aspetta, ho saltato tutta l'autopresentazione, come è possibile?
And last decade, you probably heard this discourse in the media.
Il bello della diretta.
My name is Arjun Balaji. I'm an investor at Paradigm, a crypto-focused investment firm in San Francisco.
Scusate per il salto
I'm here today to
temporale.
talk about how Bitcoin scales.
Il bello della diretta è anche questo.
A common refrain you probably heard is that Bitcoin is unscalable or that it can't securely scale.
Il terzo capitolo ovviamente adesso andiamo a vedere comunque sia la parte di Bitcoin come non può essere scalato, comunque sia difficilmente scalabile, e quindi diciamo tutta la parte, quindi la parte della global finance che ci spiegherà appunto lui, che dovrebbe essere, aspettate mi ricordo tutti quanti i nomi, ecco lui è Arjun Balaji, appunto come smascherare con Bitcoin che non è scalabile. Andiamo a vedere.
Via. If you've spent any time following Bitcoin over the last decade, you've probably heard this discourse in the media. Media stories about Bitcoin often follow a similar structure, a comparison to Visa or PayPal, describing Bitcoin's transaction fees as very high, and the conclusion that Bitcoin can never scale to support
su crypto.com.
However, the core question of how Bitcoin scales isn't new at all. It's actually one of the oldest questions.
Questo è il codice, quello
the very
di
first public
Nakamoto.
comment
Non so se
after
qualcuno di voi sa la
Satoshi released the
storia,
Bitcoin
poi
white
lui
paper
lo
in
spiega.
2010 was from James Donald, aptly describing this constraint. As highlighted below, he said, if hundreds of millions of people are doing transactions, that is a lot of bandwidth. Each must know all or a substantial part thereof. Put another way, a central tenet of Bitcoin is making sure anyone can easily validate the base layer. And this caps the potential throughput of Bitcoin. The fundamental constraints that exist limit Bitcoin's theoretical transaction throughput between 4 and 7 transactions per second, or TPS. In practice, It's been closer to the lower bound, around 3 transactions per second. It's highlighted on the chart below. This is a far cry from any major payments network like Visa, which claims to hit about 24,000 transactions per second. This is nearly 4 orders of magnitude higher than Bitcoin. These fundamental constraints come from Bitcoin's inherent block weight and interblock times. What this means is that Bitcoin blocks have a limited amount of space to include transactions, and that Bitcoin blocks don't happen continuously. They settle on average every 10 minutes. Oftentimes people ask, well, why can't we just multiply all the constants? This is a major point of friction in the scaling debate. And philosophically, this was the
Elon Musk
major focus of the blockchain block size wars of 2017 and earlier. This is even seen in Elon Musk's recent attempts to propose scaling Dogecoin to support global payments. The short answer of why we can't multiply the constants is that base layer scalability is a trade-off. A really simple model for this is the scalability trilemma, which you can see here, with 3 prongs: scalable, secure, and decentralized. Any simple scaling solution will find it really challenging or impossible to optimize for more than 2 out of 3 of decentralization, scalability, and security. One mental model of Bitcoin is that it's a train, which has limited seats and departs at limited times. In order to get a seat on the train, users have to bid for a ticket. That's the Bitcoin market. We could decide to make each carriage on the train 10 times bigger, but this comes at a cost. In this case, the cost is all imposed on users who want to run a full node. This directly trades off decentralization legacy trilemma. Today, Bitcoin's weight is already over 350 gigabytes and rapidly growing every year. Though hardware improves and storage costs drop over time, making blocks 10 times bigger would likely make it prohibitive for ordinary users to use Bitcoin without trusting an intermediary. The key takeaway is that
questo ragazzo qua mi piace perché mette un sacco di meme, anche questa qua, one does not simply scale Bitcoin by multiplying the constant.
One does not simply scale Bitcoin by multiplying the constants. So what is the right way to think about Bitcoin scaling?
Bitcoin settlement network.
One model is that Bitcoin's base layer is a settlement network and that it should be scaled like an onion in different layers. This isn't unique to Bitcoin by any means. Virtually all payment networks scale in layers, with the possible exception of physical cash, the bearer instrument. For example, credit card transactions from payment networks like Visa are intermediated by many, many different systems, including banks, payment processors, networks like Fedwire or ACH, and they ultimately settle weeks or months after the point of an exchange. So how is Bitcoin scaling today? Categorically, I think there are 3 big buckets to consider. The first is layer 2, primarily focused on Lightning. L2 solutions scale settlement assurances of the Bitcoin base layer with deferred settlement. This means that balances are ultimately settled on the base layer, but not necessarily at the point of a transaction. The second categorical approach is sidechain, which was conceptually proposed by Blockstream several years ago in 2014. Sidechain scale settlement assurances by pegging Bitcoin onto another chain, which can maintain an independent security model of the Bitcoin blockchain. Sidechains come in all flavors, including federated chains, which rely on trusted validator set, more trust minimized models, which allow Bitcoin to be able to be used on other permissionless layer 1 blockchains, like Ethereum. The third approach is scaling Bitcoin off-chain through Bitcoin banks. Today, there are hundreds of Bitcoin exchanges globally, which all help scale.
Comunque, di tutti quelli che ha parlato fino adesso, lui palesemente si vede che legge e basta. Cioè lui praticamente probabilmente si sarà preparato queste slide a casa, dove è appunto in questo momento a fare questa registrazione della conferenza, e ha palesemente letto tutto.
Settlement assurances using financial intermediaries. The critical link between all 3 classes of scaling solution is that they allow users to make trade-offs in the settlement assurances they get from Bitcoin. For example, a large institution making a Bitcoin transfer may naturally transact on layer 1. An application requiring a lot of microtransactions might be hosted on layer 2 and so on. To dig into the first solution, layer 2 systems like Lightning scale Bitcoin payments with deferred settlement. What is deferred settlement? Deferred settlement is really simple. It's like maintaining a tab at a bar. Like going to a bar, opening up a tab, and then settling at the end of the night, Lightning lets you open up a payment channel with the counterparty by setting up a funding transaction through multisig at the base layer. When you leave your credit card with the bartender, you're effectively opening up a payment channel, just like in Lightning. The bartender updates the state of the channel after every beer you order. At the time that you hand your bartender the card, your beers are effectively paid for.
È vero,
Even if you
guarda
forget
sempre
your
lo stesso
card,
punto.
the bartender can always settle at the end of the night and probably leave themselves a nice tip in the process. Similarly, Lightning allows users to independently settle to the base layer of Bitcoin blockchain anytime that they have a dispute, just like they would if they had an issue with a credit card company. The Lightning Network itself is a mesh composed of many different payment channels. As long as you have a payment channel that's actively funded, it can interface with any other payment channel without requiring you to go back to the Bitcoin blockchain. Most importantly, Lightning's security is proximate to the Bitcoin base layer. Counterparties are always able to settle back to the Bitcoin blockchain in the case of dispute. There's about 1,800 Bitcoin observable on Lightning today, and the Lightning Network has steadily grown capacity over the last few years in Bitcoin terms. This represents about $50 million US in liquidity today. Lightning is also useful because it enables the native programmability of Bitcoin, and it extends the Bitcoin script that's available on the base layer. This is particularly useful for applications that require high transaction throughput. Applications like Sphinx Chat, which are enabled by Lightning, and do valuable work on Lightning developer SDKs, which are supported by Square and many other ecosystem participants.
Sì, questa qua è utilizzabile anche
Moving to the
da
next
noi.
model of layered blockchain scaling, sidechains can help scale the Bitcoin base layer by pegging Bitcoin onto an independently secured chain. One of the most notable sidechain designs is Liquid. Liquid uses a federated security model and can be used to settle faster Bitcoin transactions between businesses. Liquid runs on a two-way peg, moving Bitcoin between the Bitcoin blockchain and the Liquid sidechain at a one-to-one rate. In Liquid, a group of trusted validators rather than miners receive transactions and broadcast valid blocks. Since Liquid is primarily used to transfer Bitcoin between businesses,
in base
validators
all'argomento
are
di prima che
mostly
stavamo
major
trattando,
crypto
lui
exchanges
sembra
and
proprio
trading firms,
un
although
pochino
anyone can use
spiritato, quello
Liquid.
è vero.
Since Liquid relies on a trusted federation for security, block times and confirmation thresholds can be different than on the Bitcoin blockchain. On the main Bitcoin blockchain, blocks come out every 10 minutes. However, on Liquid, they're produced every 1 minute. Generally, most exchanges require 6 or more confirmations on the Bitcoin blockchain. However, transactions are generally considered confirmed after only a couple of valid blocks on Liquid. This is all effectively social consensus that users can converge on based on the trade-offs that they've considered and the settlement assurances that they consider important. In Liquid, these settlement assurances can be different because of the validators that are participating in the system and the fact that most of them are trusted intermediaries already. As seen below, the Liquid Federation has many members, including many global exchanges. Another system being used to scale Bitcoin payments and usage today is Ethereum, the second largest permissionless blockchain. Today, over 255,000 Bitcoin, or about 1.2% of the fully diluted Bitcoin supply, $8 billion worth, is tokenized on Ethereum. There are many different versions of tokenized Bitcoin on Ethereum. The most popular is WBTC, custodial Bitcoin peg, operated by a trusted group of depository institutions, primarily large global exchanges like BitGo or Coinbase. WBTC can be issued on Ethereum first by depositing Bitcoin with a custodian, who then gives you an ERC20, which can then be used on Ethereum, as illustrated in the diagram below. Once the Bitcoin is tokenized on Ethereum, it can be used pretty much anywhere. An ERC20 token could be used. In the case of WBTC, it's often used in decentralized applications in Ethereum, such as the money market compound, as seen below. Over $1 billion of WBTC is currently supplied in compound and earning yield. You can imagine that Bitcoin can be used in other applications such as decentralized exchanges, decentralized financial products, and even Bitcoin margin derivatives, all powered by sidechains. In addition to scaling Bitcoin through on-chain layers like Liquid or Lightning and sidechains like Ethereum, financial institutions play a really major role in scaling the usage of Bitcoin. While the idea of using banks to scale Bitcoin might seem counterintuitive and perhaps counter to the cypherpunk ethos that Bitcoin had to begin with, from the very beginning, Bitcoin was built with the idea that it can serve as a base layer for reserve currency that can then be used by banks to scale. As Halpenny pointed out as early as 2010, it's possible that in the future, most Bitcoin transactions occur between banks, and that base layer Bitcoin transactions are executed by individuals are exceedingly rare. As Hall put it in this post, it might be as rare as buying Bitcoin in 2010. Today, about 8% of Bitcoin is held by exchanges. This is likely a lower bound, so it does appear that Hal was somewhat prophetic. There are many different protocols, such as proof of reserve, which can preserve Bitcoin's base layer guarantees. Proof of reserve allows exchanges to prove attestations of the Bitcoin that's held, so that we're not reliant on some of the issues that a fractional reserve bank might have or present in the rehypothecation of Bitcoin. To conclude, the thesis that many present is that Bitcoin's base layer is unscalable. As we've seen, this is false. The antithesis that many present is that Bitcoin's base layer scales limitlessly. As we've seen, this is also false. It presents many issues, including raising the cost of validating a full node. In fact, the synthesis is that Bitcoin settlement assurances can securely scale in layers, that users that wish to pay higher transaction fees or deal with longer confirmation times, etc., can use the base layer Bitcoin blockchain. This might be used for high value transactions. Users that need, or applications that need or rely on microtransactions can transact on layer 2, such as Lightning. Still, more trusted applications, which might require even more transaction throughput, or even new applications such as credit, can use sidechains like Ethereum or Liquid. And that presents a different set of settlement assurances of trade-offs that users can accept. And still, most users may end up transacting in Bitcoin through off-chain banks or off-chain solutions like Coinbase or BlockFi, or many of the large Bitcoin banks that exist today. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nate Madry. I'm a senior research analyst at Coinmetrics, and today I'm going to be talking about Bitcoin ownership concentration and some of the myths surrounding it. So Bitcoin supply is sometimes reported as being concentrated or controlled by whales, but how concentrated is it really, and how can we measure it? So here are two real headlines. The first one reads, over 99% of the current Bitcoin supply is held by only 10% of Bitcoin addresses. The second reads, Bitcoin whales ownership concentration is rising during rally. And this is an excerpt from that second article. A few large holders, commonly referred to as whales, continue to own most Bitcoin. About 2% of the anonymous ownership accounts that can be tracked on the cryptocurrency's blockchain control 95% of the digital asset. Now, while this is technically true, it is true that 99% of Bitcoin supply is held in 10% of Bitcoin addresses. This is misleading because it's implying that the supply is controlled by individuals or a few large holders, while in reality, this is not necessarily the case. And I'm going to go into much more details about why exactly this is misleading. But first, I think it's important to understand how we measure Bitcoin supply and how we measure Bitcoin supply concentration. So Bitcoin supply data is completely public and verifiable. Bitcoin is a pretty unprecedented financial data set in this sense, because every single Bitcoin transaction since its inception has been publicly recorded on the Bitcoin blockchain. Furthermore, anyone can run their own Bitcoin node, which is really just a piece of free open source software to view and verify.
Stavo parlando con voi perché rispondevo ad Alessandro che mi ha chiesto a che ora iniziava per quanto riguarda appunto l'intervento di Elon, e inizia alle ore 20, e poi stavo commentando la casa storta di questo signore oppure la telecamera messa per storto, cioè nel senso che non so se vedete la libreria dietro è completamente in pendenza verso destra, però abbiamo delle stupidaggini iniziali.
And that's a lot of what we do at Coinmetrics. We run our own Bitcoin nodes and other cryptocurrency nodes, so we can verify the entire transaction history. Now, in the context of kind of traditional banking and traditional financial transactions, this is pretty unheard of. Traditional banking transactions are inherently private, while Bitcoin's entire history is completely public. So in addition to be able to verify the supply, this also lets us be able to create metrics on top of the supply and kind of get a deeper analysis of exactly what's going on. You can see in this image here some of the data that's included with and viewable with Bitcoin transactions. Each transaction has its own unique ID, which is called a hash. You can see exactly how much Bitcoin is sent in each transaction, and you can see which addresses it's sent to. So building off of that transparent supply data lets us compute metrics like this. And are some of the metrics that were cited in the original article. So first here, we're seeing that the blue line on the top of this chart shows Bitcoin's total current supply.
Cioè, ora non mi sentite ora in questo momento? Perché qualcuno dice di sì, qualcuno dice di no. Fatemi sapere un voto unanime, sì o no.
And we see it's increased over time. We can track it to a very precise degree. We also see this green line here, which shows the amount of Bitcoin supply held in the top 10% of addresses. And then the red line is the amount of supply held in the top 1% of addresses. So at first glance, this does look like supply is heavily concentrated, as those articles were implying. But there's a really important caveat here, and that's that this is showing the amount of Bitcoin supply controlled by the top 10% of addresses and not necessarily the top 10% of individuals. So a Bitcoin address isn't necessarily an individual. And this is a common misconception with Bitcoin and crypto addresses in general. An address can represent many individuals, and an individual can also own many addresses. So for example, exchanges, institutions, multi-sig wallets may have a few addresses that are holding Bitcoin for hundreds or sometimes even thousands of people. On the other end of the spectrum, an individual can own many addresses, and individual investors often will hold many different Bitcoin addresses for privacy or security purposes. Also, when a Bitcoin transaction is sent, a change address is needed, and this can sometimes make it seem like there's more than one individual, while it's really just an individual who controls all of these addresses. So this shows the amount of Bitcoin held on exchanges, and this shows most of the major crypto exchanges. It does not show all of them. There are a bunch more as well. So if anything, this is probably even underestimating the amount of Bitcoin held on exchanges. But you can see here, there's at least 1.6 million Bitcoin held on exchanges, which is about 9% of total supply, and it's increased over time. 5 out of the 10 largest Bitcoin addresses belong to exchanges, including the top 2 largest addresses. The largest Bitcoin address is owned by Binance, who holds about 300,000 Bitcoin in a single address. And though if you're looking on chain, it may appear like these addresses are whales or large holders who are controlling a huge amount of Bitcoin, in reality, that's not the case. These exchanges are holding Bitcoin on behalf typically of thousands of customers, and each individual customer can choose when to deposit or withdraw their Bitcoin from that address. In addition to exchanges, a lot of large Bitcoin addresses are controlled by what we commonly refer to as dormant OGs. So in Bitcoin's early history, very early history, it was still an experimental network, and a lot of its earliest users amassed a large amount of Bitcoin and then either lost their keys or abandoned those addresses. And we can see 2 examples of that here. So the first address on the right here is a Bitcoin address that controls about $1 billion worth of Bitcoin. It's the 26th largest address in the Bitcoin network. But that address that's holding $1 billion has not had any transfers out since 2010. The most famous example of these kind of dormant OG addresses is Satoshi Nakamoto, who of course founded Bitcoin. Satoshi is believed to own over 1 million Bitcoin split across various addresses. And all of that Bitcoin has not been moved after it was originally mined. So when we're thinking Bitcoin supply and we're calculating a lot of our metrics, we typically consider this type of supply to be lost. and we exclude it from free float supply, which is basically the amount of liquid Bitcoin supply that's available. Since this $1 billion or these huge amounts of Bitcoins haven't moved.
Tra l'altro qua stiamo toccando un argomento abbastanza anche delicato, nel senso perché stiamo vedendo la parte quella del tutta la supply, quindi tanto quei numeri di Bitcoin che effettivamente ad oggi non sono più utilizzabili perché sono andati persi, perché chi li ha presi poi dopodiché li ha messi in un computer non si ricorda più la password e quindi vabbè anche lì sono andati persi. Per quanto riguarda alcuni wallet, per cui le persone li hanno tenuti su dei cold wallet, quindi dei wallet esterni, e ad oggi non riescono più a recuperarli, insomma ci sono veramente tantissimi Bitcoin. Infatti Satoshi Nakamoto dice che lui più o meno considera all'incirca 1 milione di Bitcoin divisi ovviamente tra i vari indirizzi address, appunto i vari indirizzi persi. Loro calcolano 2,3 milioni invece di Bitcoin, quindi il 12% della supply attuale che sono persi dal 2012 praticamente.
A lot of these keys have probably been lost, misplaced, and a Bitcoin key is lost. There's really no way to retrieve it, so that supply essentially is gone forever. So this is another example of
Elon will be coming to 2000 to 20.
Large addresses in the top 10%, which at first glance could seem like huge whales, but in reality, a lot of this Bitcoin probably isn't even active anymore. Lastly, investment products. So a lot of Bitcoin is increasingly being held in investment products. Grayscale is the biggest example. Grayscale's Bitcoin Trust holds about 650,000 Bitcoin, close to 3.5% of supply. Other ETFs hold over 1% of Bitcoin supply. And there's an increasing amount of wrapped Bitcoin, WBTC, which is basically a synthetic wrapper for Bitcoin that lets Bitcoin be used on the Ethereum blockchain. So these, again, are all examples of products that might control a small group of addresses that have a large amount of Bitcoin that look like whales, but really this Bitcoin is controlled by hundreds or thousands of other investors.
Ora, grazie ragazzi.
On the other end of the spectrum, there are a ton of pretty small Bitcoin addresses. So out of the 38 million Bitcoin addresses that hold a balance, about 5.8 million hold less than $1 worth of Bitcoin. And a lot of these small addresses also don't represent individuals. They're either tiny addresses that have been abandoned, or they're addresses where a single individual will own a bunch of these smaller addresses. There are over 855,000 dust addresses on Bitcoin, and a dust address is an address that's holding such a small amount of Bitcoin that it's not even really worth transferring it out of that address.
È interessante pure questo dato molto, perché comunque sia, se noi vediamo, cioè ad oggi ci sono tantissimi appunto milioni di Bitcoin in circolazione, però la cosa molto più interessante è vedere che in questo momento tutti i milioni di Bitcoin e ovviamente tutti quanti i milioni di address, quindi anche di portafogli virtuali che ci sono, insomma 855.000 di questi portafogli hanno meno di 0,00000000546 Bitcoin, che all'incirca a occhio e croce dovrebbero corrispondere forse a un centinaio d'euro, quindi in senso in tanti posseggono effettivamente Bitcoin, ma sono veramente tanti anche quelli che ne posseggono veramente pochi.
That transaction fee would be too high to make it worth it. So these smaller addresses further kind of skew this data because there's so many of these tiny addresses that also do not represent individuals, but it makes it look like supply is concentrated at the top, when really, again, these addresses aren't individuals at all. So it can be tempting to compare Bitcoin supply distribution to US wealth distribution or another fiat currency's wealth distribution. We've all seen this chart or something similar. This shows the US wealth distribution, which of course is pretty heavily weighted towards the top 1%. But this is really not a like-to-like comparison, since these wealth distributions are showing the wealth distribution of individuals.
Allora ragazzi, mentre intanto faccio continuare ovviamente la live, faccio una piccola transizione di posto, quindi di location, vi lascio ovviamente con la live che continua, tanto io mi sposto e riapparirò tra qualche minuto. Intanto disattivo soltanto questo, ok. E ci dovremmo essere sempre.
And like I just went over, Bitcoin supply distribution is showing that distribution of addresses and not individuals. Instead, it's better to understand how Bitcoin's unique supply issuance works and unique supply distribution method works, and then compare it to other cryptocurrencies. So Bitcoin was designed to have fair, transparent supply issuance. And here's how Bitcoin supply issuance works. So every time a Bitcoin block is successfully mined, the miner who won the block earns newly issued Bitcoin as a reward. And at Bitcoin's inception, this block reward started off at 50 Bitcoin per block, which is a lot. And then every 4 years since then, it's been cut in half. That reward's been cut in half, and we see that here in this chart. So it started off at 50, then got cut to 25, etc. And that halving process will keep on occurring until Bitcoin's maximum supply of 21 million is eventually reached. Now, this supply issuance method is really important because it's how Bitcoin supply gets out in the first place. It's how it's distributed, but it's also really key for securing the network. So this block reward is the main part of what incentivizes miners to contribute energy and contribute hash rate to the network, which is ultimately what secures the Bitcoin network and keeps Bitcoin safe. It's also important to note that all of Bitcoin supply has been released this way. It's all been issued through block rewards, which is not the case for every cryptocurrency. And in fact, most other cryptocurrencies do not have their entire supply released this way. They have other initial methods of releasing their supply. So that's how Bitcoin supply is initially issued. But after it's given to these miners, how does it get distributed to other holders? So Bitcoin miners, like I said, earn their revenue in Bitcoin. Most of their revenue comes from these block rewards. They also earn transaction fees. Every time a Bitcoin transaction is sent, the sender needs to pay a fee in Bitcoin, and those fees also go to the miners. So these miners are earning all of their revenue in Bitcoin, but most of their expenses still need to be paid out in their local fiat currency. That might eventually change. They might eventually be able to pay in Bitcoin or another cryptocurrency. But today, they still mostly need to pay their expenses in fiat. And expenses are things like electricity, hardware, rent, and these things aren't typically accepting Bitcoin as payment yet. So because of this helps naturally distribute Bitcoin supply. If the miners want to remain profitable over the long term, they're going to have to eventually sell some of their Bitcoin. Different miners have different methods and strategies for doing this. Some just sell Bitcoin at predetermined intervals, and some hold it for longer. But again, if they want to remain profitable, they're going to have to sell some of this Bitcoin. And here, this chart is a really interesting example of that phenomenon and that distribution method. So what this is showing here is the purple. So this is the percent of total Bitcoin supply held by different groups of addresses, where each address is holding a different amount of Bitcoin. And I'll explain exactly what that means. So this purple area here shows the total percent of Bitcoin held by addresses that are each individually holding between 10 and 100 Bitcoins. So in Bitcoin's very early years, kind of 2009, 2010, we can see that pretty much 100% of supply was held in these addresses that each individually held between 10 and 100 Bitcoin. That changed over time. But the reason for that is because, as I just explained, the initial block rewards were 50 Bitcoins. So when these early miners got their 50 Bitcoin, most of them just let it sit there in an address. They didn't really transfer it. They didn't necessarily collect more. There wasn't too much you could really do with Bitcoin in the early days, and a lot of them were still kind of viewing Bitcoin as an experiment. So most of the addresses were holding 50 or 100 Bitcoin in that range. We didn't really see that change until July 2010, when something pretty interesting happened. So in July 2010, we see this blue area of the chart start to emerge. And the blue area represents the amount of supply held in addresses that are each holding between 1 and 10 Bitcoin. So before that point, there were basically no addresses that were holding less than 10 Bitcoin, which is pretty crazy. But we see this blue area emerge. More Bitcoin supply is held in these smaller addresses that each hold between 1 and 10. And then a little later, we see the yellow area emerge, which is the amount of supply held in addresses each holding between 0 and 1 Bitcoin. So what's happening here is that in July 2010 was when the first Bitcoin exchange came online the infamous Mt. Gox, which later got hacked and is no longer online. But basically what ended up happening is these early miners started selling some of their Bitcoin when the exchange came online. And that helped naturally start distributing Bitcoin to these smaller holders. So we're seeing this distribution play out in real time in this chart. It is important to note that this is on a log scale, just so we can really see it. It makes it look a little more extreme than it was, still only kind of like less than 2% or so of total supply was held by these small addresses. But still, this is showing how this distribution method started. So this is a similar chart, but zoomed out over a longer time period, and it's on a linear scale instead of log. But we're seeing a similar pattern here. So the dark blue area is the amount of total Bitcoin held in addresses that are each holding between 10 and 100 Bitcoin. Same thing, those addresses in the early days controlled all of Bitcoin. But then over time, that Bitcoin started getting more and more distributed to smaller addresses, as well as concentrated to some larger addresses. So the pink area at the top is showing addresses that each hold at least 10,000 Bitcoin, the total amount of Bitcoin held by those addresses, which there are very few of. Then the lighter blue area is the amount of Bitcoin held in addresses that are holding between 1,000 to 10,000 Bitcoin. And again, it might look like these large addresses are holding a relatively large amount of supply, but a lot of these addresses, especially the very large ones, are exchanges or other institutions which are holding Bitcoin on behalf of others. So this is another way of viewing Bitcoin supply distribution. And instead of grouping it by addresses that are holding an absolute amount of Bitcoin, this is showing it grouped by addresses that are holding a certain percent of Bitcoin supply. So the blue area on the top, in this case, is showing addresses that each individually hold at least 0.1% of Bitcoin's total supply, which is a very large amount. So those are very large addresses. Ranging all the way down to the bottom, it's showing the amount of Bitcoin held by small addresses, held by addresses each holding less than 1/100 millionth of supply. So the reason I'm showing it this way as opposed to the last one is just because this is going to make it a little easier to compare Bitcoin supply distribution to other cryptos. But we can see here that by this grouping as well, Bitcoin supply is actually fairly well distributed amongst these different address sizes. So here's the distribution of Ethereum's native token, Ether. And we can see that comparatively a larger percent of ETH supply is held by the largest addresses at the top. So similar thing, the dark blue area at the top is showing the amount of ETH held in addresses that each individually hold at least 0.1% of supply. And compared to Bitcoin, Ethereum had a little bit of a different initial supply issuance method. Ethereum had an initial public sale where people could buy ETH, which is different from Bitcoin, where it was all issued to early miners. And we see that play out in this chart. If you look at the left-hand side of the chart, Ethereum started pretty heavily concentrated. It's gotten less concentrated over time, but the initial distribution method and distribution patterns look different from Bitcoin's chart, which we just saw. It is important to note, though, that similar to Bitcoin, Ethereum has many addresses like exchanges that hold ETH on behalf of others. It also has a lot of smart contracts like the Ethereum 2.0 smart deposit smart contract that are holding large amounts of ETH on behalf of individual investors. DeFi smart contracts are doing something similar. DeFi lending protocols are holding ETH in smart contracts, which is controlled by a bunch of individual investors. So that same caveat definitely applies for Ethereum.
È interessante vedere come Ethereum, così la distribuzione di Ethereum abbia più o meno gli stessi percentuali di wallet riguardo appunto la percentuale di wallet che abbiamo anche su Bitcoin, perché comunque sia Ethereum come total supply è molto, ma molto più alta rispetto appunto a Bitcoin. L'abbiamo visto anche appunto nei grafici precedenti con l'altro ragazzo, quello che sembrava un pochettino spiritato. E devo dire che non me l'aspettavo, in realtà pensavo ci fossero molti più investitori, possiamo dirla così, da quel punto di vista su Ethereum rispetto a Bitcoin, vista anche il prezzo minore. Probabilmente Bitcoin è ancora ad oggi considerato molto viable.
And this is Dogecoin's distribution. Dogecoin is even more heavily concentrated than ETH. There's actually a single Doge address that
Qua potevano far entrare direttamente Elon Musk a parlare di Dogecoin, tanto sa tutto lui.
Controls about 28% of total supply, which is pretty crazy because, for context, the largest Bitcoin address, which belongs to Binance, controls about 1.6% of total supply. And again, the Doge address controls 28% of total supply. Unlike Bitcoin and Ethereum, however, the owner of this large Doge address is not really publicly known. We can also see that Doge's supply has been getting more concentrated over time. More and more Doge has been going to these really large addresses. This metric is network distribution factor, aka NDF, which is a way to compare Bitcoin's or crypto supply distributions a little more directly. The way that this is calculated is it's by taking a ratio of supply held by large addresses over the total supply of that crypto. So it's basically the aggregate supply held in addresses which each individually hold at least 0.0001% of supply divided by the total supply. So a low NDF indicates a relatively distributed supply. Bitcoin has a relatively low NDF of about 0.35. Bitcoin is all the way at the bottom. It's the red line there. And then we can see Ethereum or Ether, which is the kind of
violet,
darkish green line in the middle is in the middle here. Doge is orange, a little above it. So it's a little more concentrated than ETH. But then there are also cryptos that are above Doge. So at the very top, we see XLM, which is Stellar, and XRP, which are Ripple. Both of these had pre-mines or pre-sales, and they also have foundations that hold a large amount of their crypto assets. We see a couple of stable coins here. The yellow line is USDC. The kind of purplish line, purple-pink, is Tether, the Ethereum version of Tether, both of which started off almost completely concentrated and have been getting more distributed over time with natural usage. And then at the very bottom of the chart, we can...
Secondo questa distribuzione di questo NDF, cioè Network Distribution Factor, la parte di stablecoin è quella che è più in perdita, perché comunque sia la parte purple, pink sarebbe questa qui, la parte yellow sarebbe quest'altra appunto, sarebbe quella appunto delle stablecoin, cioè USDC e il Tether. Interessante. Mentre invece vai dai Doge, to the moon. Tanto dopo le 8, to the moon davvero.
See an orangish line forking off of Bitcoin, and that's Bitcoin Cash. That one's interesting because Bitcoin Cash literally forked from Bitcoin in 2017. And when it forked, the supply concentration was exactly the same. But over time, Bitcoin Cash has been getting more and more concentrated. There's also a line that forks off Bitcoin Cash, which is Bitcoin SV. It's a little less concentrated than Bitcoin Cash, but it's still more concentrated than Bitcoin, which again just shows the importance of that initial supply distribution method, and also just speaks to Bitcoin's decentralization in general. So over time, more and more Bitcoin has been getting distributed to addresses holding small yet significant amounts. This chart shows the total amount of supply held by addresses with 0 to 1 Bitcoin. Addresses holding less than 1 Bitcoin now collectively hold almost 1 million Bitcoin. And addresses with between point...
Questo qua è di quanto effettivamente sia cambiato nel tempo la distribuzione sui vari address, sui vari wallet e quant'altro di Bitcoin. Cioè guardate quanto è cambiato quando c'è stata la percezione da 0,001%, che è praticamente il nulla. Poi abbiamo una percezione da 0,001% a 0,001, che è questa strisciolina qua blu, praticamente il niente anche questa. Poi inizia un pochettino ad allargarsi, quindi aumentare con appunto il range 0,01 a 0,01, e poi infine c'è il boom, quello che abbiamo appunto visto dal 2014 in poi praticamente, che qua sì più o meno possiamo vederlo. Guardate che distribuzione c'è tra il range 0,1 e 1, impressionante.
0,1 and 1 Bitcoin now collectively hold about 740,000 Bitcoin, and that's the red area on this chart. So, and again, going back to the beginning of this chart and beginning of Bitcoin, we can see there were basically no addresses holding less than 1 Bitcoin. So it's pretty remarkable how distributed this has gotten over time, and it's continuing to get distributed today. So in conclusion, despite misleading headlines, Bitcoin has a unique fair issuance mechanism, which has led to supply getting more distributed over time. And with the growth of Bitcoin payment mechanisms and services like Square, with the introduction of Bitcoin as legal tender in El Salvador, it will undoubtedly only continue to get...
El Salvador, tra l'altro, lo stato che ha preso Bitcoin come moneta sovrana.
More distributed as time goes on.
If
you'd like to explore the data used in this presentation, please check out charts.coinmetrics.io. You can check it out for free and download a lot of this data.
Ecco, questo qua potrebbe essere un sito, altro se qualcuno di voi intanto si vuole interessare di questi parametri e quant'altro, da dover segnare, perché ovviamente potrete avere tutte quante le metriche riguardanti Bitcoin, ma anche le altre cripto.
And that's it. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, please feel to reach out on Twitter at Coinmetrics or at Nate Madry. Thank you.
Ciao, grazie a te. Interessante. No, Michele, purtroppo la traduzione simultanea della Francia, sì, della Francia, perdonami, ho letto il tuo cognome e ho fatto la crasi, no, la traduzione simultanea della live non riuscirò a farla purtroppo, lo dico già in maniera molto tranquilla. Diciamo, lo spiego più che altro perché ormai ti sei collegato adesso. Allora, più che altro non riuscirò a farlo perché in realtà io non ci sarei dalle 8 in poi, però rimarrò lo stesso collegato per farvi vedere a voi ovviamente la live. Mettiamo in pausa la ragazza. Rimarrò lo stesso collegato appunto per farvi vedere a voi la live come va e quindi quello che dirà effettivamente Elon Musk, e insieme a voi commenterò nei commenti di questa live quello che effettivamente dirà, quindi qualsiasi cosa potete qui sempre scriverla e io vi risponderò lì direttamente.
Strategy, a firm that focuses on providing market research for institutional and retail investors about a variety of different asset classes, including digital assets. And today I'm going to talk about the misconception that Bitcoin is easy to displace. That basically the probability.
E probabilmente questa parte qua, ragazzi, non riusciremo a vederla tutta se ci vogliamo vedere la live direttamente di Elon Musk. Quindi io direi di fare dove arriviamo, tanto questo qua è un video salvato e il link lo rimetterò adesso dentro la chat per chi vuole magari andarsi a riprendere questo ultimo pezzo. Dove arriviamo, quando sono diciamo le 8 meno qualche minuto, io da qui stacco e direi di andare direttamente al prossimo capitolo e vederci direttamente la live di Elon. Fatemi sapere cosa ne pensate.
That another blockchain could come along and be superior to Bitcoin in most or all metrics.
Di niente, Michele, figurati.
So if we take a step back, basically when we talk about the success of cryptocurrency, it's reliant in very many ways on the network effect, which is also how protocols and social media platforms and a variety of other things derive their value. And so when it comes to blockchains, the stronger the network effect, the better the security and development enjoys, resulting in an entrenched advantage that gives it an almost insurmountable gap compared to competition. And so when we look at the history of Bitcoin, it's gone through basically 4 cycles of growth. And so far, those have
Ok, ragazzi, live di Elon sia
correlated. People can debate how causation plays here, but they've been rather correlated to Bitcoin's halving cycle. And so every 4 years, Bitcoin is pre-programmed to change the number of new coins that are generated every 10 minutes. And so during the course of its almost 13-year history, it's gone through this period where every 4 years is a smaller number of coins generated. But when that happens, when that kind of that difficulty, that new coin generation kicks in, that generally results in basically a supply shock, you could say. Basically, the market had already settled on a certain supply-demand balance, and when that new supply gets cut in half, that has historically led to, or at least been correlated with, a price increase, and that has often resulted in periodic bubbles that capture media attention. Then there's a correction. Bitcoin most frequently has been labeled dead, but then it recovers and continues on going forward. And so it's been rather volatile. But when we zoom out and look at this logarithmic view of the price, it's actually been the steady state of increases. And of course, the big question is, how long will this continue? Will this reach a certain plateau of multi-trillion-dollar asset and go up from there? Or will this eventually roll over and be surpassed by either some other technology, or will the whole space just no longer be effective? And most signs point to that the network effect continues to be extremely strong, and we're going to walk through some of the steps here. And so overall, Bitcoin's irreplaceable attributes largely rest on 3 different categories. So there's security, scale, and decentralization. And so they all play into each other as well. So security can help increase its scale, scale can help increase its security. But basically, when we analyze the qualities of the network, we can go through these three areas. And so, for example, in terms of security, Bitcoin's hash rate and simple base layer give it more assurances as a way to store value or transmit value than every other blockchain. When we look at scale, of course, Bitcoin's the largest protocol by market capitalization. It's also one of the largest protocols in terms of development network and how much value is transmitted in any given period of time. And then in terms of decentralization, basically there's more of a division of powers in the Bitcoin network compared to most other cryptocurrencies, even ones that are also pretty big on terms of scale. And so the next few slides will dive into these three individually with more detail. So if you focus on security, when it comes to a proof of work protocol, scale is a very big factor. And so, what this chart on the right shows is Bitcoin's hash rate. So it's a rough measure of how much processing power is used to secure the network, compared to some of its copies, like Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin Satoshi Vision, that have, they've taken the blockchain, they've forked off, they've made their own changes. And so what we see is that Bitcoin has orders of magnitude more, security than those other offshoots. An analogy that I've seen used, for example, is that almost anyone, could copy and host Wikipedia, right? So Wikipedia is not that much data. You could copy it, you could put it on your own website. But what is the chance that you'd be able to actually get the traffic that Wikipedia has? And the chance, of course, is almost zero, because even though you could replicate, the current state of Wikipedia, you'd be unable to replicate the millions and millions of links around the world pointing to Wikipedia. You'd be unable to, capture a large percentage of the user base that continually updates Wikipedia to instead go and update your version, right? So basically, Wikipedia's network effect is so entrenched that merely copying it is insufficient to become an actual competitor to Wikipedia. And so the same applies to blockchains. You can copy a blockchain, you can make your own blockchain, but unless you reach that critical mass of millions and millions of users with a well-designed protocol and appropriate decentralization and high levels of security, the blockchain is not going to be effective. And so there's only a couple blockchains that have really kind of reached that critical mass, and among them, Bitcoin has very unique characteristics. And so there's a variety of reasons that basically Bitcoin is more secure than its competing protocols. And so the fact that it uses dedicated ASICs, for example, in its mining algorithm, means that not only do you have to pay for electricity in order to mine Bitcoin, you also need to actually acquire dedicated hardware. So unlike a GPU-based blockchain, you can't merely rent, say, cloud GPUs to attack the blockchain. You'd actually need to somehow acquire the majority of the over 51% of the dedicated mining hardware. And so overall, Bitcoin has had 13 years almost of uninterrupted
Grazie cari, grazie a
uptime.
tutti.
And that's in large part based on the fact that it has a tighter and larger security network than every other blockchain out there.
Che è successo, Alessandro? Che hai scritto una parola che non posso replicare a voce.
And what's often called a bug is actually a feature, is the fact that Bitcoin is very simple, right? So many other blockchains try to do more on the base layer, whereas Bitcoin is purposely very simple on the base layer. That gives it fewer attack surfaces, that gives it fewer risks for bugs or unknown outcomes of different types of transactions. It's basically a very simple base layer, and then any additional complexity that the ecosystem might want can be built on top of it in additional layers or side chains, or there can be other blockchains for other purposes. But basically, Bitcoin itself is designed to do a small number of things very, very well. And for 13 years, that's what it's done. And so generally, when you hear about a blockchain that offers more capability on the base layer, or that has more transaction throughput, or whatever the case may be, it's always important to ask yourself, what are the trade-offs that that blockchain is making? Because you have to realize that Bitcoin, the limitations that it has are there for a reason. Those are a specific set of design choices to maximize certain areas over other areas. And so whenever...
Comunque non so se si nota tanto dal grafico, perché magari forse siamo tutti quanti presi dal vedere la linea blu, però guardate quanto hash rate in meno ci vuole per poter utilizzare Bitcoin Cash e Bitcoin SV. Cioè guardate proprio la differenza abissale negli anni, perché ovviamente non è soltanto nell'anno 2018, cioè guardate proprio già anche nell'anno 2021, proprio una differenza di calcolo altissima.
Whenever those those variables are tweaked by another blockchain, they're sacrificing some aspects generally related to security or decentralization in order to achieve more capability on the base layer. So next we'll take a look at scale. And so, of course, Bitcoin has the largest market capitalization with estimated to be well over 100 million users at this point. And that includes on-chain users as well as users on exchanges or other providers. And so if that number is correct, and many estimates have pointed in that direction, that means Bitcoin has so far reached a higher level of adoption than the internet did by this point in its life cycle. And so it's being adopted very quickly. It's the fastest asset to touch $1 trillion market capitalization. And then, when you include not only the base layer, but also additional layers like Lightning and Liquid, as well as various side chains or other things in the ecosystem, and then all the variety of apps and hardware devices that are either Bitcoin specific or Bitcoin first, kind of focused on Bitcoin. It has, one of the largest overall networks in the blockchain space. And again, the more development that goes on, the better and better the system gets, and the bigger that gap becomes compared to the other blockchains in the ecosystem. And so when we look at, for example, hardware wallets, so there's many hardware wallets that accept multiple different coins, but then there are also hardware wallets that are Bitcoin only, that only work with Bitcoin by design to enhance their security and be more specialized. And so what that ultimately means is that, for example, Bitcoin has a greater range of hardware selection than other coins in the space.
Ovviamente questi qua sulla destra che vediamo sono tutti quanti esempi di appunto hardware wallets che vengono utilizzati, che possono essere appunto dai semplici e classici appunto carte magnetiche. Questo qua sono rappresentate con Visa, però sappiamo perfettamente che ci sono dei siti che utilizzano appunto delle carte dove poter mettere i propri soldi, poterli utilizzare proprio in generale anche degli ATM di Bitcoin che sono sparsi in tutta Italia. In più vabbè, ci sono i vari cold wallet, i vari hot wallet e anche gli exchange che sono utilizzabili.
And that also applies to there's a variety of apps that only work with Bitcoin. And so in many ways, Bitcoin's ecosystem overlaps with the broader crypto space, but also has a very own dedicated.
Ciao Paolo, guarda, in questa prima parte te la faccio molto veloce anche perché a breve ci sarà la live di Elon. Allora, abbiamo visto tutta la parte quindi di consumo, quanto realmente è il consumo a livello globale di Bitcoin. Abbiamo visto tutta la parte la parte delle cripto utilizzate a livello proprio di, criminali, quindi sono utilizzate per atti illeciti, ecco, mettiamola così. E adesso stiamo vedendo tutta la parte quella della scalabilità, tutta la parte quindi quella, anzi guarda, senza che ti faccia un riassunto così molto fatto male, abbiamo visto la prima parte, appunto Bitcoin, quanto energia spreca, tutto il resto, l'attività criminale che è stata fatta, Bitcoin quanto non è effettivamente scalabile e abbiamo risolto alcuni dubbi e interrogativi, la proprietà dei Bitcoin quanto è concentrata effettivamente all'interno dei vari app e quant'altro, e poi adesso questa parte qui invece che Bitcoin non può essere spostato facilmente come effettivamente in tanti credono. Questa parte qui in maniera particolare, come ho già detto, non la finiremo del tutto, anche perché alle 8 inizia la live di Elon e quindi io la stopperò e la manderò avanti.
Dedicated Bitcoin focused part of its ecosystem. And so when you include all these different layers, Bitcoin's development network is very, very big. And an analogy I like to use that other great research in the space have used is that it's more like a protocol than anything else. And so, often people ask themselves, okay, when is Bitcoin going to be replaced by a better competitor? It operates in technology, and so naturally we have to look to see what's going to be better. Now, however, when you look at protocols in the technology realm, protocols tend to be very, very long lasting. And that's because they achieve a certain critical mass that, that acceptance is what makes them valuable. And so an example is TCP/IP. As I speak right now, I mean, that protocol is between 4 and 5 decades old, and it's still the backbone of the internet. And 20 years from now, it'll still be the backbone of the internet. And of course, the internet over time changes very rapidly, but that underlying foundation for how it works is actually rather static and rather consistent. And so Bitcoin, in many ways, is adopting that approach, where the base layer is this, purposely simple, robust platform for storing and transmitting value. And then all these other complexities can be added to it on top of it or alongside of it in different ways. But that underlying foundation doesn't have to, nor should it, change rapidly. Another example would be, for example, USB. And so USB at this point is almost 25 years old. and it's gone through 3 major upgrades over that time that are generally backwards compatible or can be made backwards compatible with the prior versions to get faster over time. And so, for example, if you were to come along and say, I made a better
Ragazzi, come ho detto anche all'inizio della live, sicuramente quello che sarà poi l'intervento di Elon Musk, ma tutto quanto quello che sarà parte della conferenza, e che poi sono altre persone che parleranno più avanti, oltre a Elon, appunto parleranno anche quelli di Ark Invest e quant'altro, però non è volto a cercare di risollevare quello che è effettivamente oggi la quotazione, diciamo, di Bitcoin e delle altre altcoin. Sicuramente se la conferenza dovesse andare bene e i discorsi dovessero essere positivi, ci sarà ovviamente della fiducia da parte degli investitori nel dover tornare a investire, però quello che serve a questa conferenza è far capire al mondo delle grandi aziende le effettive e reali potenzialità che le aziende avrebbero nel entrare nel mondo delle criptovalute e quindi nell'utilizzare Bitcoin e nell'utilizzare le altre criptovalute stesse. Quindi non è proprio un cercare di aumentare il prezzo, quindi sicuramente sarà una conseguenza, ma non è la cosa principale.
TCP/IP, basically a better way to run the internet, or I've made a slightly better USB, you have to ask yourself, what is the chance that your protocol could catch on when those other protocols already have billions of users? And so at that point, they're not even competing purely on technology. They're competing on the fact that they're already so widely accepted that it's very, very hard to displace them as long as they continue to be a good foundation for updating over time, which again is what Bitcoin has become. So lastly, we can focus on decentralization.
Questa è la parte più
and this is where,
interessante,
for example, it's useful to compare, say, Bitcoin and Ethereum, because Ethereum is the other blockchain in the space that does have a very large market capitalization and development network as well. So that's the other blockchain that has a large network effect. But that's where that similarity ends, because they actually have very different qualities in many other areas. And one of them is decentralization. So on the right here, we see for Bitcoin and Ethereum as examples, we see how much total supply they have, and then also how much new supply is issued per year. And so with the chart of Bitcoin on top, for example, we see that its supply and its issuance rate is very algorithmic. So from inception, it had a certain pattern that it was going to do, and it's done that perfectly since inception. And that's because there's really, it would take almost unanimous consensus by the Bitcoin community in order to change that outcome, right? So you would need node operators, you would need miners, and developers who basically all conspire to change Bitcoin's monetary policy. Whereas Ethereum, when we look at Ethereum at the bottom there, so Ethereum has a different design philosophy. So they use, for example, difficulty bombs on the blockchain in order to basically force a quicker update path than, say, Bitcoin has. And so what that essentially does is it gives the developers more influence over that network than developers have over the Bitcoin network.
Ah, cazzo! Raga, scusatemi, ho sbagliato io, perdonatemi tutti quanti perché avevo mutato il microfono per non far sentire tutti quanti i vari camminatori dentro casa, però vabbè. Allora, adesso mi dovreste sentire in teoria, anche se voi siete leggermente in ritardo. Comunque ho messo la live di Elon, dicevo. Ora io sparirò dallo schermo perché purtroppo mi devo alzare, quindi non sarò adesso qui presente con voi, però sarò con voi in chat. E quindi assolutamente ci vediamo, cioè ci sentiamo in chat per quello che sarà appunto il discorso che verrà fatto da Elon e tutti quanti gli altri. Cioè, nello specifico, in questa sezione parleranno appunto Katie Legno, Jack Dorsey, Elon Musk e Steve Lee. Pezzi grossi, e vediamo effettivamente quello che uscirà fuori da questa live e vediamo effettivamente quello che dirà quest'uomo, perché quest'uomo, ragazzi, sarà quello che farà purtroppo insieme a lei, perché non sottovalutate anche lei, che potranno spostare un po' di più i pesi di quanto riguarda appunto Bitcoin stesso. Bene, io intanto non lo so, avete qualche domanda, qualcosa da dover chiedere per quello che abbiamo visto fino adesso, per chiunque sia c'è stato fino adesso sulla live? Intanto questi 3 minuti possiamo intrattenerci in questo modo, se no, se invece non volete che vi intrattenga in questo modo con qualche chiacchiera, ma vi interessa soltanto focalizzarvi su quello che dirà Elon, io ingrandisco diciamo appunto a modalità teatro il video e vi lascio alla musichetta e alla suspense per Elon. Mi dispiace ragazzi, non mi sentite perché in realtà pensavo di sì, ora non mi si sente più nemmeno, immagino. Ah, ok, qualcosina mi si sente. No, scusa, ho alzato un pochettino il volume al cellulare perché volevo sapere se effettivamente mi si sentiva. Fai una previsione. Ce ne vuole, nel senso, a fare una previsione. Dovrei innanzitutto andare a vedere un attimino com'è la situazione. Vado a vedere un attimo su crypto.com, anzi su Young Platform, quindi guardate anche voi su Young Platform, sotto c'è il link in descrizione. Allora, in questo momento Bitcoin è in risalita, probabilmente sarà anche in tendenza di questa live. Se tutto va come deve andare, secondo me, no, non lo voglio dire. I 40 non lo voglio dire, però potrebbe essere una buona speranza. Considerate sempre che se sale Bitcoin saranno tutti quanti gli altri, Quindi io sono fiducioso sui 40. Mi tengo basso. La parte ottimistica non la dico. La parte ottimistica non me la tengo per me. Allora, il consumo per quanto riguarda energetico in realtà è stato nel video che abbiamo visto noi adesso, cioè poco fa, tra l'altro che te lo puoi rivedere dentro la live perché ho messo la possibilità di poter scorrere indietro. In realtà non è così grave come effettivamente tanti fanno credere e in tanti pensano, perché il consumo totale dell'elettricità mondiale per quello che riguarda l'estrazione di Bitcoin è lo 0,26%, quindi pesa sul consumo di elettricità del mondo lo 0,26% e si sta sempre più man mano andando a sottigliare grazie al fatto che comunque sia, come posso dire, stanno entrando tantissime altre aziende e stanno entrando tantissimi altri sistemi di energia rinnovabile, quindi tutto questo andrà sempre di più a far abbassare il costo dell'estrazione e anche del consumo stesso del detenere Bitcoin, perché anche quello là hanno spiegato che ha un costo di per sé. La cosa fondamentale da dover capire è che ad oggi tutti quanti quegli enti che effettivamente danno contro a Bitcoin hanno 7-15 volte di più il consumo diciamo, annuo rispetto a quello che è Bitcoin. Diciamo è una cosa un pochettino lunga da dover spiegare, non voglio ovviamente rovinarvi la live che sta per iniziare tra 15 secondi, quindi ragazzi io vi ringrazio veramente tanto di avermi seguito fino adesso, ci seguiamo adesso insieme la live di Elon Musk che inizia in questo momento, ci scriviamo in chat perché come ho detto io purtroppo in questo momento qua non ci sono, quindi buona visione a tutti.
It's time we have an informed discussion. The B Word is a Bitcoin-focused initiative that aims to correct mainstream narratives about Bitcoin, explain how institutions can embrace it, and raise awareness around areas of the network that need support. Featuring Cathie Wood, Jack Dorsey, Elon Musk, Lynn Alden, Nick Carter, and many more. Join us in our effort to support the Bitcoin network.
Welcome everybody to the B Word. I'm Steve Lee, the lead of Square Crypto, and I'm here today to moderate a discussion about Bitcoin that will span from what makes it special to its relationship with energy, the community ethos, and the future of Bitcoin, I'm joined by three special guests. The first is Cathie Wood, founder, CEO, and CIO of ARK Invest. Next is Elon Musk, techno king of Tesla and chief engineer of SpaceX. And finally, Jack Dorsey, CEO of Square and CEO of Twitter. So we have a lot to talk about today. So let's get to the talk and get right to it. I'm going to start off by asking each of you a question, which is, what's shaped and influenced your views on Bitcoin? And let's start with Cathie.
Okay, Steve, thank you. Well, the first thing was our focus on disruptive innovation. So starting in 2011, Brett Winton, our director of research, who I know will be on the program later, he started talking about this thing called Bitcoin at the time. And it was a curiosity as we were doing our brainstorms in research. But as we learned more about this open source ecosystem, that might fulfill the role of the payment system that the internet neglected to build into the system, not expecting commerce, we thought, this might be something. And then I became even more interested when I realized that my economics would come into play as well here. And Art Laffer, my mentor from USC, and a monetary scholar, in 2014, I asked him if he would collaborate on a paper on Bitcoin. And he was a bit of a naysayer at first, but agreed to read the paper. He read the paper, tore it up, and from an economics point of view, really wanted to understand this. And he said, I think you got something here. This is a rules-based monetary system. I've been waiting for this for my entire career. So the combination of disruptive innovation generally, economics on top of that, and the huge misunderstanding out there as to what this is, that was intriguing and launched our research effort.
Thank you. Elon, what's influenced your views on Bitcoin?
Well, I've thought about money for quite a while, obviously since the PayPal days. And then the companies that preceded that, X.com, which I created, and Confinity, which Peter Thiel, Max Levchin, Luke Howry, and others created. When we combined the companies and made PayPal. So I've been thinking about money for a long time. And really, I think it's best to think of money as an information system, primarily an information system for labor allocation. For practical purposes, it exists in a series of heterogeneous databases, like very different databases in bank mainframes around the world. It moves quite slowly in reality. It seems to move fast sometimes, and it does with PayPal, which is real time. But the vast majority of the systems out there are batch processing. So the actual reconciliation may take 1 to 5 business days, sometimes longer. And you have the ACH system, which is ancient and still in operation, which is allows transfers effectively like a check would be an ACH transfer, but it's not secure. And you've got the credit card systems, which are also not secure. It would be like handing your username and password to a stranger in a restaurant if you buy a meal. So there's definitely an opportunity for something that is better from an information theory standpoint. So and there you can think of it like data on a network. I think is the way to view it. What has the most throughput? What has the least error? What drops the fewest packets? Fraud, for example, being a source of error, and government interference in currencies being a source of error. But it's fundamentally an information system. So I think it makes sense to support something that improves the quality of information with which we conduct the economy. And Bitcoin is a candidate for that. It does, I think, some things well, and it's obviously it's evolving, and there are additional things like Lightning being done on top of Bitcoin. But Bitcoin per se is mostly solving for scarcity or rather solving for essentially having no throat to choke, decentralized. So there's no one who can be coerced in any way to empty their Bitcoin account. Well, I guess they could technically on an individual basis, but the system as a whole cannot. And it has an open ledger, which is also quite good. But transaction volume is low. Transaction cost is high, and usability for the average person is not yet very good. But it has a lot of potential. And I should say that, like, I'm not, and I apologize for taking a long time, but there certainly is a lot to say. In general, I'm a supporter of Bitcoin and the idea of cryptocurrency in general. But as I said publicly, we do need to watch out for crypto taking, especially Bitcoin, using proof of work to maybe use energy that's maybe a bit too much and not necessarily good for the environment. So, but on balance, I support Bitcoin, and I'm not an investor. The only publicly traded stock I own is Tesla, and the only significant thing I own outside of Tesla is my SpaceX stock that you know, helped create both companies. So, but apart from that, I do own Bitcoin, and Tesla owns Bitcoin, SpaceX owns Bitcoin, and I do personally own a bit of Ethereum and Dogecoin, of course. So.
Okay, great, thank you. And we'll get into some of those issues in more depth as well. Jack, how about you? What shaped your views of Bitcoin?
The network and the community. You know, it's deeply principled. It's weird as hell. It's always evolving, and it just reminded me of the internet when I was a kid. And you know, I encountered alt cypherpunks when I was fairly young, and this was a topic of discussion for years. I didn't touch it until 2008 when we started Square. You know, Elon and teams at X and PayPal inspired a lot of what we were trying to do, trying to bring in more to a physical world, but we encountered this crazy predatory system that was slow, that was obtuse, and I think, you know, one of the things that we tried to do, which X and PayPal also tried to do, is build an abstraction layer around this complication and around this predatory nature that the financial industry can tend to be, and make it work for people. But when I saw Bitcoin in 2009, you see a chance to replace the whole foundation. And everything that Elon was talking about in terms of ACH and the credit card networks were built with very different agendas in a very different time frame, and it's crazy that they still exist, and they have scaled, but they just are not relevant to today, and they're certainly not relevant to the future, especially when you consider the entire world and countries like Nigeria or Ghana or India, and its interconnection with countries like the United States and Canada and all over Europe. So what really drove my thinking and drives my passion around it is, like, if the internet gets a chance to get a native currency, what will that be? And to me, it's Bitcoin because of those principles, because of that creation story, because of its resilience, because of the number of tests it's been. But what inspires me the most is just the community driving it. It just reminds me of the early internet. It's the only reason that I have a career, because I learned so much from people like who are building Bitcoin today. And I continue to learn in that sense, and I'm so grateful for it.
So that's a good segue into the next question I'd like to ask you, Jack, is you said before that Bitcoin changes everything. Can you speak more to that?
Well, I just think that, you know, a lot of what we experience in life, when you really get down to the foundation, a lot of our monetary policies, a lot of our monetary systems cause so much distraction and so much cost. And when you get to a system where you have the potential for people to truly own it, they can verify it themselves, You don't have to have trust going in. You don't have to trust it at all. You can verify it through source code or whatever your appetite is. And that any particular person can help drive the future of it. And at the same time, it's not controlled by any state. It's not controlled by any bank. It's not controlled by any corporation. And these three parties of people who participate in the network, people who mine, and also the developers, constantly debating the correct roadmap and the way forward, is a beautiful thing. And I don't know of many other consensus-based models that have existed at that scale for this long with this amount of success. And we're still fairly early. So when, I met a woman in Ethiopia 2 years ago, and she was trying to create the lift for Ethiopia. Elon, I think I reached out to you at that time as well because she really wanted some Teslas. She still has to take paper fiat cash from her passengers and pay all of her drivers in the same way because there's no monetary system that she can utilize. There's nothing digital. And Africa as a continent is hugely interconnected from a monetary standpoint, but also hugely taxed in that same way. So a lot of the potential that I see, the internet having a native currency helps her build her business in a much faster way. And also if you consider something like Bitcoin existing before YouTube, before Twitter, before Facebook, a lot of the business models that we have today would not be the same. We would certainly not have the dependency we have upon the advertising business model if Bitcoin existed pre-Twitter. And I think the amount of business models that it enables, the amount of innovation it enables going forward, especially when you can consider the whole internet instead of going country by country by country by country, which you have to whenever you're dealing with finance, it really just opens the aperture. And that is what I want to see in my lifetime is a currency that is standard and sound for the internet that everyone can use.
Great. A hallmark of Bitcoin is its fixed supply of 21 million coins. Elon referenced that earlier. It may be the first system that humans have created that humans cannot later change. Kathy, I'm curious, with your background in monetary history and macroeconomics, what are your thoughts on that type of system?
Oh, well, I'll recount the story about Art Laffer and our going through the paper. And he said, as I said, first rules-based monetary system, global, ever. This is a very big idea. Once we had convinced him of the ecosystem itself. Now, this is the role that it's playing, given that the rule is a quantity rule, that 21 million units, is really a store of value role. So there are three roles of money. Store of value, very important. The means of exchange, so for transactions, and the unit of account. Every good priced in terms of whatever the unit is. So store of value is its primary use right now. The others exist. Unit of account, reserve currency of the crypto asset ecosystem. That's being seeded a little bit towards stable coins right now. But the store of value is a very big role. And means of exchange with apps built on top of the Bitcoin blockchain, we think is going to become more of a reality. Right now, high value transactions take place over Bitcoin, and that is a very useful role. So we look at those, and I remember saying to Art, "How big could this be?" And he said, "Well, how big is the U.S. monetary base?" Well, today it's $8 trillion. $8 trillion. At the time we were talking, it was $4 trillion. So we've gone through another crisis since then. And so this store of value, this idea that purchasing power will go up over time, if demand rises relative to supply. Supply ultimately fixed at 21 million units. That's a very good thing. Purchasing power going up globally around the world. And this idea that it's a hedge against confiscation of wealth. And that can take place in a myriad of ways. But inflation, and especially hyperinflation in emerging markets, is the primary way. Talk about destroying purchasing power. So that's a very big idea. And I'll also mention deflation. In some ways, it's a hedge against deflation. I know some people are confused that we at ARC think that we're in a deflationary environment here in the United States. If that is true, the odds of a hyperinflation in the rest of the world, especially in emerging markets, is also true. So, but this deflation, and we learned from 0809, there's counterparty risk associated with deflation. And I think Bitcoin would be a hedge against that eventuality as well. So it's a very big idea.
Right. I suspect among us, there's not a lot of debate about Bitcoin's potential as a store of value. But Jack, you referenced earlier it being or becoming the native currency of the internet. Can you speak more to that and also how it relates to maybe how institutions think about it?
Yeah, I mean, like just simple example, if I happen to be in Ghana and my family is in Nigeria, currently I can take anywhere from, and I need to send money back, anywhere from 10 to 30% off the top just to send that money back. Whereas if you just focus on the worldwide remittance problem, Bitcoin solves so many of those problems today instantly without having to go through any intermediaries or any slowness or complicated systems that a corporation or state created. So I think you know, having sound money with that is separate from the state is the idea. Having it completely verifiable by everyone, including the state, including corporations, including individuals, including developers who want to build on top of it, is quite powerful, and that's what keeps it secure and strong. And I think that's, you know, we need more of that, which is why this one of the reasons why this conversation is so important is as entities come into the space, it's not just buying an asset and holding on to an asset and treating it as an investment. There's something special that created this, and something precious and something very unique, which has to be protected, and we need to do whatever we can to help that thrive as well.
Elon, I'm curious your opinion on this. You mentioned earlier about Bitcoin's throughput, or the importance of throughput, maybe some concerns around Bitcoin. Can you speak, do you think Bitcoin can become peer-to-peer cash?
Well, Bitcoin does have a fundamental scarcity limit at the base layer that's designed in. That doesn't mean you can't have some layer 2 system in theory like Lightning. And I understand Lightning is doing well in some small countries. There's some question mark as to whether you need a money transmitter license, just a debate as to whether that's needed, given that it is not open ledger. So that's a whole separate debate, of course. But Bitcoin by itself simply cannot scale to be the monetary system for the world at base layer. But with a second layer, this is possible depending upon how that second layer is implemented. Yeah, that's part of why I think there may be some merit to something that may seem silly, like Ethereum, like Dogecoin. I think Ethereum also, like I said, the three things I own outside of SpaceX and Tesla, and obviously it's a Neuralink and Boring Company, but of any significance are Bitcoin by far, and then some Ethereum and some Doge. So you know, if the price of Bitcoin goes down, I lose money. I'm not sort of, you know, I might pump, but I don't dump. So, you know, it's not a case of, I definitely do not believe in getting the price high and selling or anything like that. And I would like to see Bitcoin succeed. I think there's some merit to, this is not a slam on Bitcoin, there's some merit to considering something that has a higher max transaction rate and lower transaction cost, and kind of seeing how far you could take a single layer network where the exchanges act as a de facto second layer. I think you can probably take that further than people realize, and as bandwidth increases over time, latency decreases. SpaceX's Starlink is actually playing a role in this, and I think long term people will probably have, access to worldwide access to gigabit level connectivity at low latency, and so at low cost. And so then your base layer could do a lot of transactions if you take that into account. So yeah, but like I said, Bitcoin with a layer 2 system certainly could scale to do a vast number of transactions. Same goes for Ethereum.
Question about the scaling at the layer 1. The concern from the past 5 years of debate in the Bitcoin community is that that would sacrifice too much decentralization and hurt the censorship-resistant properties of Bitcoin. I'm curious if what are your thoughts on that? Are you sensitive to that? And are you concerned about losing some of the special properties of Bitcoin or another cryptocurrency by scaling at layer 1?
Yeah, I mean, these things are helpful to use the physics tools of thinking and say, scale up, scale down, and see if it still makes sense. So if scaling up the transaction block doesn't make sense, why don't you scale it down? And have it be, so that somebody, with a laptop from 2008 can still run a Bitcoin node. Why not slow it down? Oh, you want to slow it down? Well, maybe you're at the wrong number then.
there's actually there's members in the community that do want to slow it down, but I understand your point.
It's silly. The reality is the average person is not going to run a Bitcoin node. So this is and Bitcoin, it was a lot of clever ideas, but these parameters were set, I don't know, what, in 2008 or something, maybe 2009. And there's been some improvements since then, but not a lot. So, it's sort of like there was still in 2008 there was still a non-trivial number of people on modems. So, now it is quite common to get 100 megabits connection just for a house. Some houses have gigabit connections. So, and that trend is obviously in the direction of higher bandwidth and lower latency. And if somebody else doesn't do it, Starlink certainly will. So I have high confidence that you will be able to maintain a decentralized finance system while still having a much bigger blockchain, aka ASCII text ledger, a hash ledger. You can make the hash ledger bigger without suffering from decentralization as the average connectivity improves, obviously.
One idea would be to to put a Bitcoin full node in Starlink terminals. That way more people would be running it.
Actually, I have run this by the team at one point. I had this idea, which is kind of off the wall, but let's say you need a little space heater, and normally your space heater would just be pure entropy. But what if that space heater was also a Bitcoin, Ethereum, Doge mining node? Pick your currency, and so then you'd be heated up, and you would also mine your crypto and have connectivity in one.
I love that idea.
Yeah, I mean, better than running a space heater.
Absolutely. Are there any other, so you're drawn to Dogecoin a little bit. Are there any other gaps in Bitcoin that you see that cause you to be drawn towards Dogecoin?
Oh, I think, I mean, I think there's Doge has the Doge community, I think, is somewhat irreverent, obviously, and has great memes and loves dogs, and I love dogs and memes, and it doesn't take itself too seriously, and I think there's Occam's razor, which is the simplest answer is the most likely. It's a summary of Occam's razor. The simplest answer is the most likely one. Then there's a friend of mine came up with a variant on that the most ironic outcome is the most likely one. And then I have a variant on that, which is the most entertaining outcome is the most likely one. So if that is true, then the most ironic and entertaining outcome would be that the cryptocurrency that was started as a joke to make fun of cryptocurrencies ends up being the leading cryptocurrency. That would be the most ironic outcome.
Jack, what are your thoughts on that? Is Bitcoin resilient enough to overcome that?
I think it's resilient, but also I think like you find, I mean, that's what attracts me to Bitcoin in the first place is the irreverence. A lot of that just brings it forward, and at first go it makes it a little bit inaccessible, but as people get into it, it makes it more accessible and more spreadable. And I absolutely think the resilience is there. I think it's important to have fun as well. And anyway folks can express themselves. I think that goes back to the main idea of like, how do we create a native currency for the internet? Anything that goes towards that path, like that's whatever wackiness or fun we can have along the way, that's going to make it a lot more enjoyable, and it's going to make a lot more people want to use it.
I'd also point out there's nothing stopping someone from creating a Bitcoin wallet that's like fun and has memes, has dogs. That's possible as well. Great. Let's move on.
Right now at this point.
Let's move on to the next topic, which is Bitcoin and energy. It's a really hot topic that lots of people are talking about. Let's start with Elon. You've been vocal on this. You've said that. I mean, you said many things about it. You've also said that Tesla will resume payments in Bitcoin payments if the renewable energy is approximately 50% and sort of looks like it's on a positive future trend. What do you think the state of things are with respect to that?
Yeah, so I do think that there appears to be a positive trend in the energy usage of Bitcoin. Actually, part of this is due to the drop in Bitcoin price. What I observed, or what I thought I was seeing, there may be some disagreements on this, but from when Tesla announced that it had acquired Bitcoin and was doing Bitcoin transactions, there was a massive run-up in the Bitcoin price, and also a massive increase in the amount of energy used to mine Bitcoin. And I think I understand renewable energy quite a bit. I mean, Tesla does solar and interacts with a lot of wind generation through our mega pack, because basically need to store energy from wind and from solar. So we're pretty plugged into the renewable energy industry. And there's just no way that you could basically double or triple the amount of energy in such a short period of time with renewables. You could shovel coal that fast. And so I was like, look, this is too sketchy. Tesla's mission is accelerating the advent of sustainable energy. We can't be the company that does that and also not do appropriate diligence on the energy usage of Bitcoin. So all I did was I said, look, we're going to suspend Bitcoin transactions for now. We're not selling any Bitcoin, nor am I selling anything personally, or nor is SpaceX selling any Bitcoin. Again, I want to emphasize SpaceX, Tesla, and I own Bitcoin. I also own a little bit of Ethereum and Doge, but the companies just own Bitcoin, and the Bitcoin that I own is worth much more than the Ethereum or Doge. So clearly, if I'm, if these actions negatively affect me financially, if I was clearly financially motivated, then I would not express this reticence about Bitcoin energy usage. Now, it looks like Bitcoin is shifting a lot more towards renewables, and a bunch of the heavy-duty coal plants that were being used, unequivocally being used, this is not a question mark, have been shut down, especially in China. So I think it's probably, I would want to do a little bit more diligence to confirm could confirm that the percentage of renewable energy usage is most likely sort of at or above 50%, and that there is a trend towards increasing that number, and if so, then Tesla will resume Bitcoin, accepting Bitcoin. Yeah, so I think we want to just do a little bit more diligence, and I think, but most likely the answer is that Tesla would resume accepting Bitcoin, most likely.
That's
Steve,
great to hear. I would
Steve,
agree with that. Kathy?
Yeah, may I ask a question? Elon, I'm not quite sure if you saw the paper that Square and ARC did together on making Bitcoin mining a part of a utility, a broad-based utility ecosystem, whereby, the overage from sunshine or wind powers the Bitcoin mining machine, thereby enabling the proliferation of renewables to a much faster extent or at a faster rate than otherwise would be the case. What do you think of that?
Well, the problem is that in order to operate so-called mining or hashing rigs, in order to operate a bunch of hashing rigs, effectively, you have to run them 24/7, which means you need base load. You can do that with solar and wind plus battery, but if you only did it based on solar wind overage, your hashing rig utilization would be much less. So you'd be at a disadvantage.
Sure,
hydro or geothermal are great as renewable means. I'm also pro-nuclear. I think modern nuclear power plants are safe, contrary to what people may think. I really think it's possible to make very, very extremely safe nuclear. I'm talking about fission. You don't need fusion. And then, of course, fusion. You just got that big fusion reactor in the sky called the sun. It comes up every day. But I think a combination of solar and wind plus stationary storage will get you that base load, so you can run hashing 24/7.
Jack, I'm curious. You've stated that Bitcoin incentivizes renewable energy. That's what we're talking about now. Do you have any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, everything that Elon said and Kathy mentioned, but it's also incentivizing a lot of innovation in just energy space, and just like looking at unused energy. There's a company called Great American Mining that caps the methane flares on oil fields to power their rigs. And you just imagine, and you mentioned nuclear, Elon, as well, and just imagine all the unused energy that is just being wasted every single day. And being able to get that energy and converting it into a secure, sound money system for the planet feels like a worthy trade-off. And that's the sort of incentive that I think is most powerful, is like, how do we reuse what is being currently just dumped on the ground and wasted and not considered, and how do we do that at scale? And I think that's a bigger conversation that I think is missing. But I agree with everything that Elon has said, and also the paper we put forth.
I'm curious if any of you have thoughts on how what the industry can do to accelerate the transition to renewable energy. And like Elon specifically, could Tesla Energy or Starlink play a role?
Well, I think Tesla can play a role, Tesla's literal reason for existence. The reason I've put so much of my life energy into Tesla, which is a lot. In fact, I would say that I've had some pretty tough life experiences, and Tesla is responsible for probably 2/3 of all personal and professional pain combined, just to give you a sense of perspective there. So this is a hella hard situation. But we do solar, commercial solar, solar retrofit, as well as the solar roof. And we make consumer battery packs called Powerwall for houses and small businesses. And then the utility scale, which are gigantic. These we've done now a number of gigawatt hour installations. Like that's a lot. That's a lot. And a lot of them actually have been for load leveling the grid. Mostly they are, and combined with like big, so like the first really big one we did, which is 100 megawatt installation in Australia. That's actually helped stabilize a huge portion of the South Australian grid, because it's able to react so fast. In fact, at first, they've got a billing system in Australia that I think works at the sort of millisecond level, and we were operating at the microsecond level. So the system was operating so fast that the measuring system couldn't see it. But so Tesla's certainly doing a lot to enable renewables, especially wind and solar. And in fact, the limiting factor for us right now is cell production. So we need to both internally get the Tesla internal battery cells produced, as well as increase supply from suppliers. I mean, generally, when I talk to our suppliers, they say, how many cells would you like us? Like, how many cells can you make? Because sometimes they're like concerned, like, well, is Tesla going to compete with them on cells? I'm like, no. If you want to make the cells, be our guest. It's just that we need a crazy number of batteries, and they need to be done. It obviously needs to be mined and produced and manufactured in an ethical and environmentally sound way. So, at Tesla, we really do aspire to be the good guys, like, to be a company that people can believe in. It doesn't mean we don't make mistakes, but that's what we try. So, yeah, but I think generally hydro, especially existing hydro, is good for mining. Geothermal, there's lots of places in the world that have geothermal energy. And like I said, nuclear is also good. Yeah, I think just I'm like as I said earlier, the expectation is not like that the energy production must be pure as the driven snow, but it must it can't be using it also cannot be using the world's dirtiest coal, which was for a moment there. That's just difficult for Tesla to support in that situation. So I think, but I do think long-term renewable energy will actually be the cheapest form of energy. It just doesn't happen overnight. But as long as there is a conscious and determined and real effort by the mining community to move towards renewables, then obviously Tesla can support that.
That's great. Kathy, we've been talking a lot about energy, but many institutions are facing questions around Bitcoin's relationship with ESG. Can you maybe speak a little bit more to what is S and G in ESG and how Bitcoin might support those?
Sure. So E, of course, is environmental, S is social, and G is governance. And there is a massive movement afoot in the institutional world, especially, to embrace ESG and make sure that their asset managers are doing the same. So we've just talked about environmental, and I really do believe that Bitcoin will be much more environmentally friendly, certainly than traditional gold mining or the traditional financial services sector. In many ways, it already is, and it's just going to get better that way. In terms of social, I know that many institutions, when they are thinking of social, they think of diversity and equity, pay equity, and all of that. But from our point of view, the disruptive innovation point of view, social is much more than that. It is saving lives, of course, autonomous technology, that would be another topic for Elon. But in this case, allowing access to payment technology, as Jack is saying, everywhere around the world without friction. And just back to the remittance example, I think if I've got these stats correctly, there are certain countries in the world that are incredibly dependent on remittances for, GDP. Tonga, 37%, El Salvador, which just deemed Bitcoin legal currencies, 24%, Nepal, 24%. And I think the remittance industry globally, roughly 700 billion. So saving people these egregious fees, think about it, you're paying anywhere from 8% to, as Jack said, 30% of your $100 that you're sending back to your family. That is social responsibility, I would submit, as is just the economic empowerment that Bitcoin will enable. We've talked about that already. And I know that Alex Gladstein is going to be talking later about, the 4.3 billion people in the world who are hostage to authoritarian regimes, or the 1.3 billion who are living in double-digit and triple-digit inflation, if not more. Saving them from the destruction of their purchasing power certainly is a noble social goal. So we expand social to be much more than the traditional ESG community. And then on governance, you've got the transparency of the ecosystem. It's completely transparent, unlike the opaqueness of financial systems and the toll takers in the traditional financial world. And I think a huge part of governance in the Bitcoin ecosystem are the Bitcoin core developers. Now, before I met them, and I've had the pleasure and the honor of meeting many of them, that was a part of this ecosystem I didn't understand. But actually getting to sit down and talk to them, if I have a learning curve need, it certainly is on the technology side. But in terms of talking to them about economics, economic theory, failed monetary regimes historically, they know economic history, many of them, better than anyone I've ever met. So that gives me a great degree of confidence that, they do believe they are on a noble mission. They could be paid a lot more than they're being paid right now if they worked at Google or Facebook or some of these other areas. But they've chosen, this sense of purpose for a noble goal. And they have incredibly strong technology backgrounds. As well as a good understanding of economic history, especially monetary history. And it gives me a great deal of comfort as I think about the governance of the ecosystem, much more so than I think we would find in other financial ecosystems. And just to give you an example of that, I think 2 years, we were talking about, not apparently, there's a big debate about reorganizations, I know, in the Ethereum network right now. Well, we saw the core Bitcoin developers and others at work back in 2019 when Binance tried to reorganize in order to reclaim 7,000 Bitcoin that were hacked. And they just wouldn't allow it. So we've already had some very good tests of the Bitcoin ecosystem, including developers. So that would be my answer.
Thank you. And it's a great transition to the next topic area, which is Bitcoin ethos. And what is Bitcoin ethos? I mean, Bitcoin was born as open source and it's very transparent. There's also a staunch defense from the community around decentralization and a lot of the core principles of Bitcoin. So let's talk a little bit about that and what makes it special. Jack, Square has done a lot to support open source Bitcoin. Can you tell us a little bit about what Square has done and what advice you'd have for other institutions looking to follow in its footsteps?
Yeah, I mean, I was very skeptical of corporations when I was a kid, and I'm still skeptical of corporations today. And as we've use corporations to be, they've been great vessels for what we need to do and the ideas that we need to bring to the world. But, Bitcoin is not that. And when we were considering Bitcoin and how Square intersected, I was really concerned with how we don't disrupt the community in a negative way, how we promote what is amazing about it, and how we help it grow in that way, in the way that it wants to. So we created your team, Steve, which is Square Crypto, which is hiring open source developers to work on whatever they want and whatever they think is most important to help Bitcoin. We created an organization called Copo, which we gave up all of our crypto patents so that the community can use them in defense against trolls and some crazy characters we won't name. And we continue to find ways that, following that Bitcoin path, we're going to create a hardware wallet. We're probably going to do a lot more in hardware. Everything that we do in the space is going to be completely open source, from the hardware design to the software, taking in the community's push. And we're building a developer platform as well in the same open development, open source, and completely transparent. So I think as institutions or companies like ours consider getting in the space, I think contribution back to the community is important. Tesla did this with accepting payments for Tesla and finding security holes and improving the stack. And as I said before, we can't just see this as an asset that we own and an investment vehicle. This is something that has the potential to change everything and make the lives of everyone on this planet better in some small, maybe marginal way, but those margins will be meaningful as they compound over time.
Great. Elon, you've tweeted before that any wallet that doesn't give the user their private keys should be avoided at all costs. Can you tell us more about why is that important, and how does what's its relationship with decentralization?
Well, it's difficult to say that if you own crypto in an exchange and the exchange does not give you your private keys, it's not clear that you own anything. I mean, if there's something that, if that exchange breaks or is hacked or or is subject to seizure by the government or something like that, your crypto is gone. So in order to actually have a properly decentralized finance, which I'm a fan of, I think it makes sense. Then you have to own your private keys, and you should be the only one who has your private keys. So if you're the only one who has the private keys, then you own it. If someone else has your private keys, effectively they own it too, and the security of your crypto is then dependent upon them or any entity that can affect them. So yeah, I think what Jack's doing sounds like a good idea to have a hardware wallet that's the only thing that contains your private keys. I think that's like in terms of sort of empowering the people, which I very much believe in. Then I think you want to have people have their own wallets and be the only ones that have the private keys to that wallet. So-called wallet, the other side of the crypto.
Right. I agree, and I think we'll see an emergence too of new solutions that use multi-sig, like with a 2 of 3 keys, where the user has 2 keys, and then you get assisted custody by having an institution hold a 3rd key. Can be a good solution as well. Yeah.
Well, you can just put your private key in something that has dual access or voting access as an application on an existing network.
Right. So the Bitcoin community is known for staunchly defending Bitcoin's principles. Sometimes it can be rude and aggressive, but I think what it stems from is just a desire to not have wealthy or powerful people or institutions negatively impacting Bitcoin or sort of changing the rules in favor of them. I'm curious to hear from each of you what role you feel like you and your own institutions, your own companies What role can you play in Bitcoin, and how do you positively impact it without having these negative drawbacks? Kathy, maybe start with you.
Sure. Yes. Well, ARC has stood for two things: democratization and transparency. We're the closest you'll find to a venture capital fund in the public equity markets, and I kind of feel that Bitcoin, or we have Bitcoin's DNA from that point of view. One of the things in terms of democratization is education. We have one of our missions, values, is to educate. And I do believe that that some of Yassine El-Mandra's white papers, Yassine's our lead crypto analyst, who's worked very closely with you, Steve, on this conference, are helping the cause. We've done, and not only for retail investors, we found that we had to do a bit more when it came to institutional investors, just because of the way that they invest and the way they like to receive information. So just like in our investments, we've been, the retail community has been more attracted to us first, and now the institutional community is coming along. So I do think our transparency of research, especially in the social world, social media, pushing our research out for free to anyone, is part of our way of helping the community. And I do think encouraging, and this is something that Jack just said, I would encourage the support of the Bitcoin core developer community. As I said before, it's amazing to me, having gotten to know some of them, how strong their sense of purpose is here. And so we'd like to be helpful in making that happen as well.
That's great. Jack, how about you? How do you view your own personal role and the companies you run?
I think my own personal role through the companies I run is to really push for more decentralization. Like everything that we intend to do with the wallet, being non-custodial, building a developer platform, focusing on non-custodial solutions. On the Square side is important, being completely open development and open source, but I also think it's important on the Twitter side as well. My biggest focus right now is on a decentralized social media protocol. We're calling it Blue Sky. It's super early, but we've learned a lot from what makes Bitcoin Bitcoin and why that's important. I've learned a lot in that sense as well. And I think, just continuing to push on that thread and show it with our actions every single day in support of this community that's taught me so much and I think will benefit so many people. That's what I'm focused on.
What about letting Twitter advertisers pay in?
Yeah, I think enabling anyone. As you know, Elon, if we had Bitcoin or native currency for the internet before Twitter started, it just creates so many different business models that we wouldn't have to be so dependent upon advertising generally. And sure. I do believe that, that we have them, any form of payment that they want to use, we should be able to take. So absolutely, but I'm more focused on how do we create economic incentives in the network itself without having to rely on advertising.
Yeah, it's just that the money has to come off of the crypto so-called coins, the hash strings, have to come off and get translated into real products and services. So the more sort of off-ramps there are to real products and services, even at the institutional level, although there are certainly many small advertisers on Twitter, it seems like accepting Bitcoin, maybe some other cryptos for advertising payments on Twitter would be supportive of Bitcoin.
100%, and also looking at just general commerce through Twitter itself.
That would be great. Sorry, what, Elon?
I was asking Jack if he's going to do it.
Oh. Can we get a product announcement today? Elon, how about you? You know, you obviously, you're a big personality on Twitter. What are your thoughts on your role and your company's role in Bitcoin and sort of preserving the ethos?
Yeah, I mean, I generally think we should do things that benefit the people as a whole and increase the probability that the future is good. So, you know, I think to me, it just seems self-evident that we should kind of take these set of actions most likely to make the future good. And I think probably, you know, crypto or, you know, some of the cryptocurrencies will make the future better, most likely. It's not, you know, I always think of these things in terms of probabilities, but I think it's probably better for there to be a prosperous Bitcoin, Ethereum, Dogecoin, maybe some others in the future. And I think it can have an empowering effect for individuals and increase the power of the individual relative to government. And really, like, you know, if you think of government is just a corporation in the limit. So sometimes some people are like against corporations, but for government. It's like, guys, government is just a corporation in the limit. It's the biggest corporation of all, and it's got a monopoly on violence. So if you don't like corporations, you should really hate government.
There you go. All right. We got about, we'll try to wrap up in 10 minutes. So let's move on to future of Bitcoin. So Tesla and Square have both put Bitcoin on the balance sheet. Kathy, I'm curious to hear from you. What advice would you have for other institutions looking to put Bitcoin on their balance sheet?
Well, I guess the first piece of advice is, you know, just make sure, and I actually learned this after both Square and Tesla put Bitcoin on their balance sheet. You know, Bitcoin is being treated as an intangible asset. And so we need to get FASB to reconsider this, because with an intangible asset, if the asset goes up in price, it can't be marked up on their books. But if it goes down, it must be marked down. So, you know, there's some asymmetry there, which is, you know, we need to change that given what we believe Bitcoin is. And I do believe if, I'll harken back to something, well, it was either Elon or Jack said, you know, think about it, you know, you take away the boundaries, the different currencies, just think about how explosive growth could be and how wide-reaching taking the friction out of the system could be. So I would encourage corporations to think about that this ability to do business anywhere in the world. Ultimately, obviously, you know, we're you know, paving the way here. That's certainly a consideration. It also will serve as a hedge against inflation, especially, and as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of emerging markets that are suffering from significant inflation. In other words, the purchasing power of those populations is going down. So they are going to migrate to Bitcoin and other ways to preserve purchasing power. And again, being able to sell to them in that kind of currency would be very useful. I'd also suggest, once again, this idea of deflation, I think, is going to be a real thing. There's going to be good deflation caused by innovation, so demand will boom because of that. There's going to be bad deflation because so many companies out there have not been investing enough in innovation. Their products are going to go obsolete, as you know, and they're going to be stuck trying to service the debt that they piled on because their shareholders wanted profits and wanted them now. You know, so they leveraged up to buy back their shares and pay dividends, and so I think that's going to be the source of bad deflation and counterparty risk. And we learned from 08-09 that counterparty risk can be devastating, almost cataclysmic. So a hedge against that as well, I think, would be another reason to do it.
Great.
Yeah, it's funny. It kind of like Tesla's bank balances in Europe have negative interest rate. It drives me crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, technically, if you've got like 2% inflation on 1% interest, you're technically minus 1% return. But nonetheless, it is quite annoying to just see your bank balance drop in real time in Europe. Europe has negative interest rates. This is insane.
Paying the banks, paying the banks to hold
the bank to keep your money. I'm like, what?
It is crazy.
Like, what? We definitely move that into Bitcoin.
I believe Ray Dalio said, buy Bitcoin and not bonds. So there you go.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Jack, you've talked about design being an underfunded area in Bitcoin. And Elon earlier mentioned, usability could improve a lot. I don't think anyone's going to argue with that. What do you see as the future of how can design impact Bitcoin?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Bitcoin network is beautifully designed as a protocol in the way it works. I mean, it went after a single problem, and it does in an absolutely astounding way. But I think the endpoints of people getting into it is still a little bit confusing. So I think the more energy we spend on wallets and making sure that the wallets are simple and accessible and they're non-custodial as well. I think the best example of this is that I know of is probably this wallet called Moon. And it's just simple, straightforward. It's a great, it does an amazing thing with key management that, my mom and friends new to Bitcoin can understand. Does amazing in storage, and it also has a very clever implementation of Lightning so that you can use it in a transactional way without having to think about it, just with QR codes in a way that makes sense. So more work like that, I think, really brings us forward.
Great. Let's wrap things up with a final question for each of you. I guess what is your hope for Bitcoin? How it can impact the world? Let's see, Elon, do you want to start with that? So what's your hope? What's your hope for Bitcoin?
Well, my hope for I guess crypto in general is that it can improve the efficiency of the information system that we call money. So if the core efficiency of money is improved and and money has less error, where, like I said, error is like any kind of government interference or fraud or anything like that, this will naturally lead to basically a better standard of living and more power to the individual, which I very much agree with.
Great. Kathy?
Yeah, and I would segue from what Elon just said is, money has powerful network effect qualities. And so, we talked about ESG earlier. I think that, of course, that aspiration, having, this money be the best from an ESG point of view, that's really talking about solving some of the world's problems right now, which we definitely want to do. But I also am very excited about this idea of network effect and the convergence of blockchain technology and artificial intelligence from a technology point of view. I think, think about the internet in the earliest days. We couldn't imagine what was going to happen, but the impetus to growth was pretty incredible. So I am looking at this rules-based monetary policy, making for better lives around the world, as we've just said. But I'm also looking at the technology itself and the convergence between blockchain technology and artificial intelligence, to change the world in ways that we cannot imagine right now, solving even more problems, but creating more opportunities as well, which is the history of technology and disruptive innovation.
Jack, what's your hope for Bitcoin?
My hope is that it creates world peace or helps create world peace. I mean, Elon said it earlier, like we have all these monopolies of violence and the individual doesn't have power. And the amount of cost and distraction that comes from our monetary system today is real. And it takes away attention from the bigger problems. Some of the bigger problems that Elon is trying to solve, like get us to a multi-planetary humanity. All these distractions that we have to deal with on a daily basis take away from those bigger goals that affect every single person on this planet, increasingly so. So it may sound a little bit ridiculous, but like you fix that foundational level and everything above it improves in such a dramatic way. So it's going to be long term, but my hope is definitely peace.
That's fantastic. Well, I'd like to thank all three of you for giving us your time today. It's been a fantastic conversation. Thank you to the audience for tuning in. The B word is not just this discussion, but we have a lineup of incredible speakers and content. So I encourage everyone to check it out. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks.
Thank you all.
Ragazzi, rieccomi qua. Buonasera a tutti di nuovo. Scusatemi l'assenza purtroppo durante questa live. Beh, che dire, nulla di entusiasmante in realtà, perché fondamentalmente non è stato nulla entusiasmante, però era una cosa che vi avevo già accennato, nel senso, questo tipo di conferenza era stata fatta semplicemente per poter appunto far conoscere le potenzialità effettive di quelle che sono il mondo delle criptovalute per, diciamo, per le aziende che fondamentalmente in futuro potrebbero entrare in questo mondo. Prima nei commenti comunque ho cercato più o meno di potervi spiegare i vari argomenti che stavano effettivamente affrontando, ascoltando insieme a voi le domande che venivano poste. Devo essere sincero, mi aspettavo anche qualcosina in più, però non ero troppo, ecco, diciamo, come posso dire, non ero troppo, diciamo, appunto positivo, come magari molti di voi, nel fatto che avrebbero pompato tantissimo questa cosa delle criptovalute. Probabilmente mi si sente anche poco nell'audio, però ecco, quello che adesso ho abbassato tutto, quello che vogliamo un attimo riassumervi, anche perché mi sono segnato, diciamo, le parti un pochettino più salienti che abbiamo attraversato tramite appunto questa live, sono appunto nella prima parte si è parlato fondamentalmente di che cosa pensa ognuno di loro sul mondo delle criptovalute e nello specifico, scusate, per quanto riguarda appunto Bitcoin. Quindi sia Katie che Elon che il CEO di Twitter hanno risposto a questa domanda in maniera molto generica, forse Elon un po' troppo scocciato, mettiamola così. Per quello che riguarda invece la parte seconda, la seconda domanda era riguardante le energie rinnovabili, cioè è stata fatta una piccola provocazione fondamentalmente sul fatto che effettivamente il mondo delle cripto si sta spostando tanto verso le energie rinnovabili e se questo potrebbe essere diciamo, la strada giusta fondamentalmente. Hanno detto tutti quanti più o meno di sì, certo hanno detto c'è ancora tantissimo lavoro da dover fare, tutto il resto. L'unico che è rimasto un pochettino più tirato, mettiamola così, è stato Elon, che ha detto sì, ok, però il problema di Bitcoin è il fatto del proof of work, che è ancora troppo dispendioso per ogni singolo individuo, e soprattutto il problema fondamentalmente di Bitcoin è che appunto, diciamo, sfrutta ancora questo algoritmo del proof of work che, per quanto si va verso l'ecologico, servirà sempre tanta energia per poterlo estrarre, e secondo lui sarebbe meglio riuscire a utilizzare un altro tipo di tecnologia. Ovviamente in seguito a questa domanda si sono sviluppati tutti quanti, diciamo, dei dialoghi, dei dibattiti in base appunto a che cosa sarebbe meglio, quale sarebbe la migliore energia, e la migliore energia ovviamente che è stata, diciamo, che è uscita fuori ovviamente è quella rinnovabile, cercare di riuscire ad arrivare a un 100% di rinnovabile eccetera eccetera. Hanno chiesto in che modo effettivamente Elon avrebbe potuto contribuire a questa, diciamo, a questa miglioria, e lui ha detto in maniera abbastanza esplicita che sicuramente c'è l'energia solare e nucleare da poter utilizzare, ma che non debbano essere le uniche strade da dover intraprendere. Nelle ultime parti hanno parlato delle potenzialità che le aziende avrebbero nel poter entrare in questo mondo. Ovviamente hanno parlato anche dei rischi che potrebbero esserci, e Katie è stata abbastanza chiara nel definirli catastrofici. E l'ultima domanda invece che è stata posta, proprio quest'ultima qua, è stata: qual è la vostra speranza per Bitcoin nel futuro? Ovviamente Elon ha detto che nel futuro si spera che possano crescere quelli che sono gli investimenti, quindi i soldi e il potere delle criptovalute all'interno appunto del sistema, quindi che possono effettivamente essere diciamo, presi in considerazione. Katie concorda con Elon e anche il CEO di Twitter, ma la cosa che Katie ha aggiunto, che secondo me è molto più interessante, è la possibilità che blockchain e intelligenza artificiali comunque sia possano collaborare insieme, non tanto appunto per poter risolvere quelli che sono i problemi ad oggi esistenti sul mondo delle criptovalute, ma quanto per poter cercare di creare nuove opportunità e nuovi modi di poter effettivamente utilizzare questo mondo. Questo diciamo è stata a grandi linee, prendetela comunque sia con le pinze, sarà a grandi linee quello che era appunto la live di oggi. Non so, avete domande e quant'altro, fatemi sapere comunque sia, perché cerco di rispondervi, se no altrimenti io direi che vi posso anche mandare in pace, dopo 3 ore e un quarto di live potrei mandarvi in pace. Esatto, sì, praticamente domani alle 6 abbiamo la sveglia per andare a lavorare, ma quello penso sia sempre, comunque anche se avessero parlato molto bene stasera, comunque saremmo dovuti andare a lavorare. Grazie ragazzi per i complimenti. Scusate se sono stato un pochettino, cioè sono stato assente durante la live, ma innanzitutto sarebbe stato difficile comunque, anche se ero presente, riuscire a parlare e a tradurvi effettivamente in maniera simultanea quello che vi stavano dicendo. E soprattutto sarebbe stato anche brutto perché non potevo mettere in pausa. Se mettevo in pausa avremmo perso dei pezzi perché non era registrato come il video che abbiamo visto all'inizio. Quindi diciamo che assolutamente forse andrà meglio così, da un certo punto di vista andrà molto meglio così. Grazie tanto soprattutto per tutte quante le persone che si sono interessate nel cercare di supportarmi durante questa live, perché l'ho apprezzato veramente tanto, l'ho apprezzato. Non le faccio spesso, in realtà questa qua è la mia seconda live che faccio su YouTube e devo dire che ha portato degli ottimi risultati. Se tante volte vi doveste interessare live future anche su questo argomento, sarebbe magari interessante riuscirle a riportare, non so, fatemi sapere anche su questo se vi interessa. Sì, Lorenzo, effettivamente un pochettino di aria fritta ne hanno parlato. Sui pagamenti Tesla in realtà non hanno ancora detto nulla, però hanno praticamente, Elon fondamentalmente si è semplicemente un pochettino, diciamo, spostato nel dover dire che effettivamente se Bitcoin dovesse mantenere questo trend, dovesse comunque sia continuare a utilizzare energie rinnovabili, lui potrebbe assolutamente pensare di reintegrarlo come metodo di pagamento, soprattutto in merito al fatto che anche SpaceX stesso comunque sia detiene Bitcoin, quindi anche l'altra azienda, oltre a lui stesso come persona, oltre a Tesla, detengono Bitcoin. Grazie Luca, ti ringrazio veramente tanto, sono contento che questa live ti sia piaciuta. Di Doge in realtà ha soltanto accennato quando ha fatto la comparazione con Bitcoin, cioè nel senso lui ha parlato del fatto che sicuramente Doge un domani potrebbe crescere, potrebbe avere ottime potenzialità in quanto anche oggi, ma anche quello che sarà un domani, ha dei costi e efficienza sicuramente minori rispetto a quelli che ha Bitcoin. Lui lo preferisce per tanti motivi che ovviamente ha già spiegato sui vari tweet e quant'altro, non è che l'ha approfondito su questa live, su questa conferenza. Ciao Ignaro, buona serata. Quindi diciamo ecco appunto da quel punto di vista Doge non è che è stato proprio approfondito. Ciao Stefano, anche a te. Vabbè ragazzi, io direi che se non avete... Ciao, non l'ho seguita, hanno detto tue parole su Ethereum. Ah, sì, hanno detto anche qualcosa su Ethereum. Ovviamente l'unica cosa che è stata detto su Ethereum è stata che Elon detiene Ethereum. Stop, non è stato detto nient'altro. Su Shiba Inu no, non è stato detto assolutamente niente. No ragazzi, grazie a voi, siete stati voi gentilissimi, capirai. Per me è stato tanto che un piacere. Grazie Domenico, sei stato veramente gentile. No, non ha parlato nessuna di queste criptovalute in realtà minori rispetto appunto a Bitcoin, ha soltanto accennato a Doge, al fatto che è migliore a livello di scalabilità e funzionalità e ha parlato del fatto che detiene Ethereum. Stop, delle altre cripto non ne ha proprio parlato. Ciao Gabri, buona serata, grazie per essere passato e essere stato presente praticamente la maggior parte della live. Ciao Tommaso, grazie mille, è stato gentilissimo anche tu a passare. Vabbè ragazzi, io direi che ci siamo, possiamo stoppare la live anche perché, ripeto, è tanto che siamo connessi, abbiamo visto una bella conferenza. Io tante volte c'è qualcuno ancora curioso, vi giro di nuovo il link. Ops. Vi giro di nuovo il link perché ovviamente la conferenza sta continuando, non c'è Elon Musk ovviamente che parla, ci sono altre persone, altri CEO di altre aziende che stanno effettivamente parlando in questo momento, quindi se vi dovesse interessare assolutamente passate sul link questo qui e andate a vedervele perché comunque sono sempre approfondimenti interessanti da dover vedere. Per chi non c'è stato nella prima parte abbiamo visto tanti appunto approfondimenti su quelli che sono i costi energetici effettivi, su quanto effettivamente produce e consuma Bitcoin, insomma ci sono stati degli approfondimenti molto specifici e molto, secondo me, anche molto carini. Ringrazio ovviamente tutti quanti voi che avete messo like, che avete partecipato in maniera attiva a questa live. Spero che anche chi non ha partecipato in maniera attiva si sia divertito, comunque sia, e abbia imparato soprattutto tante cose nuove. Capisco anche la frustrazione di tanti sul fatto che quest'ultima parte di live, soprattutto la live, quella di Elon Musk, sarebbe stata tanto attesa per far ripartire la bull run di Bitcoin, ma non penso che sia ancora questo il momento. Secondo me ne dovremo aspettare ancora di acqua che passa sotto i ponti. Verso settembre-ottobre forse si smuoverà un pochettino il mercato, se no altrimenti se ne parlerà di gennaio prossimo, ragazzi. Forza Hellas Verona sempre, anche se io in realtà non tifo calcio. Grazie Stefano, sei stato gentilissimo tu, no, figurati che è troppo buono, è normale. Vabbè ragazzi, io non so in realtà come terminare una streaming, di solito cioè non termino mai le streaming, termino sempre i video, quindi vabbè, vi saluto come al mio solito. See you later, ciao ciao ragazzi.